Good morning, and welcome to the first hearing of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's 2026 annual report cycle. Thanks very much to our witnesses for sharing their expertise and for the work that you've put into your testimonies, and thanks very much to our staff as well for the preparation that went into today. I'd also like to thank the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for allowing us to use their hearing room and the Senate recording studio for their assistance live streaming this event. All written testimonies and a transcript of this hearing will be posted on our website, uscc.gov. Today's hearing addresses the critical role of India in U.S.-China competition. India is the world's largest democracy, most populous country, and a major economic and military power. It's the only power in South Asia capable of balancing China over the long term. Yet India faces a militarized border, the risk of a two-front contingency involving Pakistan, as well as expanding Chinese influence in neighboring states from Nepal to Bangladesh. China also continues to bolster its naval presence in the Bay of Bengal and across the Indian Ocean, giving rise to a new theater for rivalry between the Asian powers. Despite political, economic, and military pressure from Beijing, New Delhi has strengthened its own capabilities and signaled that it will not acquiesce to a Sino-centric South Asia. At the same time, India remains committed to a policy of strategic autonomy, engaging in renewed dialogues with China as it continues to seek economic and security partnerships with the United States. For the United States, the implications are significant. If China constrains India's strategic position, the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific will tilt decisively in China's favor. If India remains a confident and capable counterweight, the outlook for the future of a free and open Indo-Pacific is much brighter. While areas of friction have tested U.S.-India relations over the past year, both India and the United States have signaled ongoing commitments to one another. These have included the October 2025 framework for the U.S.-India Major Defense Partnership and the recently announced interim trade framework. Against this backdrop, our witnesses will provide their insights on the key geopolitical and economic challenges shaping the U.S.-India relationship, as well as India-China relations. I will now turn the floor over to my colleague and co-chair for this hearing, Commissioner John Stivers.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands. Welcome, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. India is a country with tremendous opportunity. It's poised for an advancement, and if realized, will cement its place among the premier global powers. Already the world's fastest growing major economy, India is a leader in certain services and pharmaceutical sectors and is making strides in various industrial and emerging technological fields. Now the world's most populous country, India is set to enjoy a demographic dividend in the decades ahead from its youth, especially relative to an aging China. While there is good reason to believe that India's moment has come, challenges persist both internally and externally, not least of which is the deeply intertwined yet imbalanced economic relationship with the People's Republic of China. India's large and growing bilateral trade deficit with China is a source of consternation for the country's leaders as they seek to promote self-reliance initiatives. In particular, Indian manufacturers largely depend on Chinese suppliers for components and industrial inputs for their own export-oriented growth. Some of these dependencies have significant consequences for the United States as well. India is a top supplier of our generic drugs, yet India relies extensively on China for the pharmaceutical ingredients and key startup materials. And while these dependencies present risks and exposure to economic coercion, inexpensive inputs and regionally integrated supply networks also have benefited India and hastened the pace of industrialization. New Delhi, therefore, faces a challenging balancing act vis-a-vis China between economic security and industrial development. With rising national security concerns and a slowing economy in China, companies are seeking to diversify their supply chains out of the country. India is the only global market with a vast and growing workforce, a strong STEM pipeline for high-skilled workers, and long-term growth trajectory capable of meaningfully absorbing and replacing a significant share of China's role in global supply chains. The country has a dynamic entrepreneurial spirit, excelling as a software as a service and touting over 100 technological startups valued at above $1 billion. Perhaps more importantly, India's democratic system and adherence to the rule of law create the underlying conditions for fair and transparent commerce. It's my fundamental belief that a strong and economically dynamic India is firmly in the national interests of the United States, particularly as strategic competition with China intensifies. India's scale, demographic, economic, military, makes it the only country in Asia with the potential to serve as a long-term counterweight to China's regional dominance. As a fellow democracy and growing role in the Indo-Pacific, India contributes to maritime security, supply chain diversification, and technological collaboration that all reduce overdependence on China. And supporting India's rise strengthens a multipolar Asia anchored by sovereign states rather than coercive influence, reinforcing a balance of power that aligns with U.S. economic and security interests over the coming decades. So our witnesses today, especially on panel 2, will examine India's highly consequential and asymmetric economic relationship with China, the ramifications with the United States, and strategic opportunities for deeper economic cooperation between the U.S. and India. And beyond exploring these issues, the hearing will inform recommendations and pressing issues before Congress, including how the U.S. and India can strengthen resilience on pharmaceutical and other supply chains, promote technology integration with better aligned export controls, and deepen mutually beneficial trade and investment ties. India's continued industrial and tech development in the decades ahead will have an outsized influence on the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and broad-ranging consequences for the U.S.-China strategic competition. So I'll now turn the floor over to my colleagues and the co-chair for this hearing, Commissioner Halbrands, to introduce our esteemed witnesses.
Great. Our first panel will assess the diplomatic and security dimensions of the India-China relationship and the implications for the U.S. We'll start by welcoming back Dr. Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Her work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. And her testimony will provide an assessment of India's role in the Indo-Pacific and its response to China's growing power. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Soumya Lalwani, a senior advisor with the Special Competitive Studies Project and a former South Asia expert at the U.S. Institute for Peace. He's going to examine China's challenge to India's geopolitical and security interests. And third, we'll hear from Lindsey Ford, vice president at Beacon Global Strategies. Ms. Ford formerly served as senior director for South Asia at the NSC. Her testimony will provide context and policy options around U.S.-India security cooperation. Both Ms. Ford and Dr. Lalwani are new voices for this commission, and we're happy to welcome back Dr. Madan as well. Thank you all very much for being here today. We're looking forward to your remarks. I ask that each of you please keep your remarks to 7 minutes, and Dr. Madan, we'll begin with you.
Co-chairs Tivers and Brands, members of the Commission and staff, thank you for the opportunity to testify on India's perceptions of and response to China's growing power in the Indo-Pacific and globally. Over the last 2 decades, Indian policymakers have gone from seeing China as a potential enabler to more of an obstruction in achieving India's objectives. This change has affected India's approach towards China, its policies in various functional domains, as well as its partnerships. And this shift towards more intensified competition with China has persisted despite an ongoing re-engagement process between India and China. Driving this shift have been several border crises, including the fatal Sino-Indian military clash in 2020, as well as other bilateral friction points. It has also been amplified by Indian concerns about China's ambitions, its activities, and its influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. In its immediate neighborhood, New Delhi has long believed that China's close partnership with Pakistan is designed to contain India. In the rest of South Asia, and in India's extended maritime and territorial neighborhood, it has worried that Beijing's expanded security and economic footprint is boosting China's interests and influence and curbing those of India. This has contributed to a negative Indian view of China's Belt and Road and other regional initiatives. India's wariness also reflects a broader concern that Beijing seeks a unipolar Asia where it gets to set the terms. New Delhi has stated that it instead wants a multipolar Asia where countries have room to make their own choices. Moreover, India believes a multipolar Asia is essential for a multipolar world, one in which India seeks to be a leading power. India does share certain views with China on the global order. For instance, they are both sovereignty hawks and resent interference in their internal affairs, and both oppose Western sanctions and have backed efforts to support trade in local currencies. But in recent years, Sino-Indian divergences have outweighed convergences on the global stage as well. There are differences on issues like trade, where they earlier used to cooperate. Furthermore, while India wants more representative multilateralism, it sees China as an obstacle to Indian membership of institutions like the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the UN Security Council. New Delhi also has concerns about Beijing trying to undercut India's influence in the developing world and even in groupings where they are members like BRICS. and it is wary of China imposing its vision and its standards through its global security, development, civilizational, and governance initiatives, none of which India has endorsed. New Delhi also has little desire to sign on to Beijing and Moscow's efforts to reshape BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization from non-West platforms to anti-West ones. These regional and global apprehensions have contributed to India adapting and enhancing its own outreach in its immediate and extended neighborhood, as well as in the global south. These concerns, combined with a Sino-Indian capabilities gap that limits how much India can respond alone, have also affected India's view of the US role in Asia. In contrast to Beijing, New Delhi has, in recent years, wanted to see a persisting or even expanded American presence in the region. And India has indeed sought to partner with the US and other like-minded countries, including Australia, France, Japan, and the United Kingdom, to compete for influence with China in the Indo-Pacific. India has also been participating in minilaterals, such as the Quad, that are designed in part to offset Chinese advantages regionally and globally. Furthermore, it is cooperating with China's rivals to shape the leadership, agendas, and outcomes at regional and global institutions. New Delhi has particularly perceived a Washington willing to compete with an assertive China as a useful partner in India's balancing strategy. This has made India more responsive to US efforts to partner with India bilaterally in the Indo-Pacific and more willing to manage India-US differences. It has also made India more ready to join US initiatives on issues such as critical emerging technologies and supply chain resilience. There has, however, been a debate in India about how far and fast to deepen ties with the US, and India's current concerns about the US approach towards India and China, if they persist, could limit the pace and extent of Indian cooperation with the US, and it could shape the nature and extent of Sino-Indian re-engagement. Any alleviation in those concerns would be helpful to enable greater US-India cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. In addition, in terms of the road ahead, the administration should be encouraged to undertake regular and updated assessments of India-China dynamics to include issues such as likely India-China contingencies and possible pathways for Sino-Indian re-engagement and their implications for the US. The administration should also be encouraged to undertake assessments of what capabilities would make India a more effective US partner in balancing China in the Indo-Pacific and enable or encourage allies to enable those Indian capabilities. Along with considering reviving or updating various bilateral dialogue mechanisms, there should also be more regular US-India consultations on China to exchange perspectives and discuss response options. This should ideally include updating each other on stabilization efforts with China in order to reassure each other. The administration should also be encouraged to undertake with the Indian government a dialogue on Chinese activities in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. This can help enable more effective collaboration and coordination, avoid duplication, and deconflict New Delhi's and Washington's approaches in the region. There should also be bilateral or Quad consultations to coordinate ahead of key regional and global summits, a stepping up of Quad activities in the regional security, economic security, and technology domains, and mapping efforts to identify regional infrastructure gaps or supply chain vulnerabilities. Finally, there should be more and frequent congressional exchanges with Indian counterparts on China and the Indo-Pacific, and ideally more visits by members and staff to India with a China or Indo-Pacific focused agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lalwani.
Co-Brands chairs and stivers, distinguished commissioners and commission staff, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing on India, China, and the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. It's an honor to be here alongside esteemed experts on this panel. My testimony today will focus on 6 aspects of the evolving China-India military competition. First, in spite of efforts to stabilize the bilateral relationship, India profoundly distrusts Beijing's intentions and behavior and will continue to regard China as an adversary. Despite disengagement from key face-off points, New Delhi remains deeply threatened by China's aggression on the disputed border and continued military buildup rather than de-escalation over the past 16 months. India also feels threatened by China's active efforts to arm, train, and wire the Pakistan military, India's historic adversary. Like much of the world, New Delhi has been subjected to China's economic imbalance and coercion, and India explicitly distrusts China's technology stack, particularly in critical digital infrastructure that can be weaponized for surveillance, disruption, and coercion. Second, the China-India border remains highly militarized, and that military balance increasingly favors China. Over the past 5 to 10 years, the PLA has enhanced its advantages in logistics and firepower in Tibet, and even while India tries to catch up. The PLA built up or upgraded a number of dual-use airfields, logistics hubs, and missile forces that enhance rapid mobilization and power projection. New air defense complexes, forward bases, and hardened shelters near the border suggest preparation for sustained high-intensity operations. Extensive road, rail, heliport, and border village infrastructure compresses mobilization timelines. In the past year, aggressive PLA exercises and forward H-6 bomber deployments signal rising operational readiness. Despite devoting increased resources to the Army and border infrastructure, India still faces structural disadvantages in logistics, terrain, long-range fires, and integrated ISR networks, affording Beijing escalation dominance along the frontier. This growing military imbalance could weaken deterrence and lead to conflict. A potential crisis, such as a Dalai Lama succession crisis, could inadvertently escalate into large-scale conventional conflict. But Chinese leaders might also perceive strategic incentives to deliberately coerce or initiate conflict against India, to settle the border before India modernizes, to punish alignment with the United States, or to test out new capabilities in an easier land campaign. Third, India's May 2025 conflict with Pakistan revealed to New Delhi the density of the two-front threat posed by the China-Pakistan axis. The conflict may have served as a catalyst to shift Indian strategic thinking, moving from a theoretical two-front threat to a one-front reinforced reality, where China and Pakistan actively collaborate on military campaigns. During this conflict, Pakistan seemingly operated as an extension of the Chinese military. It received live inputs from Beijing's space-based intelligence and tactical data links, and relied on high-end Chinese fighter jets, missiles, drones, and air defense systems. Beijing seems committed to arming Pakistan even more to alter the regional balance of power and potentially bog down India on the subcontinent. New Delhi is exploring various offset strategies to counter this two-front reality. Fourth, China's substantial inroads into the Indian Ocean have eroded India's resident advantages. China's Navy is steadily building the capacity and infrastructure for sustained Indian Ocean operations to secure sea lanes and overseas interests. Rapid surface combatant growth, expanding logistics networks, and advocacy within China for an Indian Ocean force create the foundation for future power projection. Routine deployments of warships, submarines, surveillance vessels, fishing fleets, port visits, and increasingly complex exercises, especially with Pakistan, are normalizing a persistent PLA Navy presence. Such a Chinese military presence could be used to secure sea lines of communication, but also intimidate regional states, threaten shipping, and conduct offensive operations deep in the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, India's Navy has suffered from budget constraints, procurement delays, and diversion of resources to continental threats, shrinking its relative advantage. Fortunately, India is showing some signs of turnaround and now increasing investments in its own A2AD architecture to balance China, including maritime ISR, submarines, long-range missiles, and dual-use infrastructure in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Fifth, New Delhi's stakes in Taiwan security are rising. In the event of a cross-strait crisis, India has the potential to contribute to deterrence by preparing meaningful military contributions to a coalitional defense of Taiwan and the First Island chain. A Taiwan conflict would disrupt digital infrastructure critical to India's services economy, eliminate an important technology partner, and free China to concentrate more pressure on India's borders. Consequently, Indian officials are studying options ranging from opening a Western front to assuming greater maritime security responsibilities in the Indian Ocean in order to free U.S. forces for Pacific operations. India could also provide logistics access, ISR, overflight rights, and defense industrial surge capacity to a coalition response, especially in a protracted conflict. As U.S.-India defense cooperation deepens, the mere prospect of Indian involvement may complicate Chinese planning and strengthen collective deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Sixth, and finally, to support a more stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, Congress should take several steps to bolster the U.S.-India defense partnership and deterrence capacities. Congress should increase the resources to support Indian military capacity and build individual and procedural interoperability, including standing operations, training and exercises, professional military education, staff exchanges, liaison officers, and unit-to-unit activities. This could be modeled on or nested within the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Congress should increase the resources for mechanisms that bolster collaboration of U.S.-India defense innovation, ecosystems and defense industrial collaboration, especially with the Indian private sector. These include accelerators, challenge prizes, Indus X summits and expos, trade delegations, foreign comparative testing, R&D, and joint project agreements. Finally, streamlining export controls modeled on AUKUS-style frameworks would accelerate Indian military access to commercial sensing and dual-use technologies in prioritized domains, identified by the 10-year U.S.-India Major Defense Partnership Framework. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Thanks very much. Ms. Ford, over to you.
Thank you so much. Commissioners, I appreciate the opportunity to be here to testify at today's hearing. It is a pleasure to join my colleagues for this important conversation. I'd like to start by underscoring 3 essential points about the U.S.-India security partnership. First, a strong U.S.-India partnership is an essential component of deterrence against Beijing. For the United States, a partnership with India provides 2 unique advantages: geography and scale. Over the next 20 years, no other close Asian partner can provide similar industrial and demographic advantages, as well as pressure on China's contested geography. For India, a closer partnership with the United States provides power acceleration, allowing New Delhi to more rapidly address political, industrial, and military disadvantages it will be hard for it to close in the near term. Both Washington and New Delhi are often hesitant to acknowledge our shared need for interdependence, but there are few partnerships that provide as much positional advantage against the PRC. Second, while the U.S.-India partnership will never be an alliance, policymakers should push toward a defense partnership that shares as many alliance-like functions as possible. Our defense partnership has already taken on many functions not dissimilar to U.S. alliances in the past decade. Indian officers now serve at U.S. military commands, we are integrating our defense industrial bases, and our militaries exercise together across all domains, including space. This is a stunning pace of change in a relatively short amount of time. And today, the fundamental challenge to closer defense cooperation is strategic will and political trust. It is not operational constraints. The past year has undoubtedly made those challenges more difficult, but policymakers should not shy away from being ambitious in pushing the outer bounds of the defense partnership. Third, one of the key challenges to building a closer defense partnership will be to reconcile our shared relationships with Pakistan and Russia. Although both the U.S.-Pakistan and India-Russia partnerships have narrowed in the past several years, they can still undermine U.S.-India cooperation, a dynamic that has been particularly apparent over the past year. Neither the United States nor India will give the other a veto over its foreign partnerships, but the need to make difficult trade-offs is likely to grow if we wish to pursue more meaningful information sharing, operational coordination, and technological integration. This will increasingly require frank conversations about the specific activities that each partner views as triggering unacceptable risks to its own interests. It will also necessitate more concerted efforts to align our export control and technology security practices with each other. Looking ahead, defense and technology cooperation can provide ballast in the bilateral relationship as Indian and U.S. policymakers continue to work through what will undoubtedly be challenging conversations related to trade. Over the next year, U.S. security policy toward India should look toward 4 objectives. First, restoring Indian confidence in U.S. support for its military modernization. The May 2025 India-Pakistan crisis created deep concern for New Delhi, both accelerating internal debates about India's requirements for PRC-focused crises, as well as reigniting lingering concerns about U.S. reliability as a security partner. The U.S. has a vested interest in helping India close key gaps in military deterrence against the PRC, but in the absence of confidence in U.S. assistance, New Delhi is likely to lean into indigenization in ways that will slow the pace of its modernization. U.S. policymakers should accelerate efforts to identify additional opportunities to share high-end capabilities, conduct risk assessments on how we could do so, and look for ways to provide India with near-term advantages even as it continues to pursue its long-term indigenization goals. This should include a focus on areas such as air defenses, long-range fires, and undersea capabilities. Second, re-energizing defense industry and defense technology cooperation. Too often, U.S.-India defense industry collaboration stalls out because it focuses on ambitious projects with overly long development timelines. We face the same risks today. The US and India need to refocus their efforts on building deterrence more quickly, accelerating existing defense trade and focusing on near-term innovation priorities. This should include joint drone manufacturing, collaboration on dual-use technologies through the India-US Defense Acceleration Ecosystem, INDUS-X, and exploring legislative efforts to enable license-free defense trade. Third, establishing more frequent high-level bilateral dialogues on China policy. With both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi planning to meet Xi Jinping in 2026, there is real potential for misunderstanding or misalignment on China policy this next year, and that alignment anchors the US-India defense partnership. US policymakers should make it a priority to engage at the highest levels with India, both before and after high-level meetings with the PRC, and to establish new dialogues to better coordinate on China policy. For its part, Congress can play a role by ensuring these conversations are not only held by a small group of executive branch officials, but also include a broader dialogue with Indian politicians and business leaders who can shape the space for US-India defense ties. And finally, leveraging the Quad to expand India's operational coordination with the United States and like-minded allies. Recent tensions between Washington and New Delhi could damper efforts to be ambitious in expanding sensitive bilateral operational cooperation right now. However, recent progress in India's ties with both Japan and Australia could open the aperture for new security cooperation among Quad partners. US policymakers should work with Australia and Japan to identify existing exercises or training activities that could include India, especially in areas with a clear connection to PRC deterrence, such as logistics, maritime surveillance, and anti-submarine warfare. They should also look for new opportunities to extend the geographic reach of allied deterrence by expanding Quad operational activities across a fuller breadth of the eastern and western Indo-Pacific region. Commissioners, the US and India have a vested interest not only in their partnership, but also in each other's success. It is important for us to reiterate that to each other. While the past year has exposed underlying fragility in our bilateral partnership, Washington and New Delhi now have an opportunity to recommit to building a more sustainable and resilient partnership. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse the chair's prerogative to ask the first question, and I'm actually going to start exactly where you ended. So obviously, we're coming out of a year of some tension in the U.S.-India relationship. It looks hopefully like the worst of that is behind us. But, and I'll pose this to the entire panel and would be happy to hear reflections from any and all of you on this. How have the events of the past year, if at all, affected the Indian government's view of the U.S. and the strategic environment, and affected either on the upside or the downside the possibilities for future cooperation? You want to get started, Ms. Ford, and then we can just go across the panel?
Sure. I think there has long been a debate in New Delhi, in the strategic thinker community, about how much it was acceptable to rely on the United States as a security partner. And what the past year has done is it has amplified the voices within the Indian community who have always said that the US was a bad bet for India. And what we have seen is parts of the Indian community who have argued that a closer relationship with Russia, a closer relationship with Europe was a safer bet for New Delhi. Those voices have more sway right now. And we have seen India accelerate what it is doing with Europe on trade. We have seen a variety of defense agreements and initiatives starting with Europe that in some cases, I think in different circumstances would have gone to the United States as a priority. And we have seen things like Indian re-upping S-400 purchases and conversations with Russia and China in ways that I think could have been prevented or at least dampened if the US-India relationship was closer. I don't think that means, however, that it's the end of the day, because I think the US-India partnership in the last decade has constantly surprised us with low lows that were worse than we ever expected and a remarkable ability to rebound.
I would concur with Ms. Ford on this. I do think that there's been exposure of U.S. unreliability or perceptions of unreliability, and that leads to what I'd call an uncertainty discount in the relationship, which just means that all the things that we plan to do in the strategic and military and technological domain take longer and maybe cost more in terms of efforts and resources and bureaucratic energy, and so that I think just slows us down for the effort that we're trying to make, which is to balance China more effectively and rapidly. And the last point I'd say is that there's also an uncertainty about U.S.-China policy, right? And that too leads to could sort of lead India back towards some sort of hedging behavior. I do think in this case, India believes the United States to sort of be this anchor balancer, and the absence of it would revert to sort of more sort of security-oriented, hedging behavior.
I think there are two sides of this coin. One, I think in terms of the fragility of the relationship, there are aspects of this last 6 to 8 months that have shown the relationship in certain parts to be fragile. What you've also seen is that in terms of a reaction is in that debate that I mentioned on this constant debate in India on how far and fast to deepen ties with the US. I think these last few months have weakened the hands of those within the Indian government that have argued for going at a higher speed and at a larger scale. You have also seen, I think, that it hasn't caused the Sino-Indian re-engagement, but it has added impetus. And so one hopes that this moment of kind of re-engagement with the US is sustainable, because I think that could shape how far that Sino-Indian re-engagement goes. I will say the other thing on the fragility side is today the fact that you are hearing Indian officials and senior Indian officials not just talking about de-risking from China, but also from the US, is a change from the last few years. Finally, in terms of kind of the more negative side of the situation, one of the things that Indian government officials would say that the reason you could see so much more alignment that governments in India, both this one and the previous one, could make decisions that were crossing certain of India's self-imposed red lines to align with the US had been that the Indian street was with the US. I think if you start to see, and you have seen some degradation in that positivity about the US, it constrains the hands of Indian politicians who start to see relations with the US not as an asset, but a liability. Having said all that, what has been remarkable, which would not have been the case, I think, 5 or 10 years ago, is the resilience of the relationship, despite not just concerns in India about can we trust the US, in the US in the previous few years about, well, can the US find India reliable, is the relationship has remained resilient. And you've also seen functional cooperation, including defense and security cooperation, continue despite these economic concerns in the last few years.
Thanks very much. Commissioner Stivers.
Co-chair's prerogative. I wasn't ready. You betcha. You betcha. Okay, the first question let's see, caught me off guard here. China has increased its activities and influence throughout the South Asia region. And so the first question I have would be, setting aside Pakistan for a second, which I know is a huge issue in and of itself, what are the activities that China has pursued in the rest of South Asia, and Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal, that are most worrisome to Indian policymakers?
Sure. I think I would highlight a few. First, we've seen a lot of reports in recent years about China's maritime behavior in the Indian Ocean, increasing use of civilian research vessels for hydrologic surveys that I think for Indian policymakers raise a lot of concerns that the South China Sea today could essentially be the Indian Ocean tomorrow. Question about what those ships are doing. We've seen the Department of Defense talk publicly about China's desire for dual-use facilities elsewhere in the world, including potentially places in South Asia. This is a real concern for India about a growing Chinese military presence, potentially in places right on India's maritime border where China has not previously had the logistical reach. And third, we've seen a lot of reporting about activities such as villages being built up all along the contested border between the United States and India in a way that has the potential to put real pressure on India at various points, whether that's Bhutan or Nepal, making it harder for India to have a stable situation along the border. So in sum, I think we have seen a variety of military activities that put pressure both on the maritime border and the land border for India.
Just to add to that, in addition to the sort of government or state survey vessels, and there's also fishing fleets that are operating now in the Indian Ocean that I think there's reason to suspect that they might be enabling PLAN sort of activity. It was particularly conspicuous during the May 2025 war. If you see sort of satellite imagery of sort of where they're lined up on sort of the edge of the Indian EEZ. And then in terms of dual use infrastructure, in addition to sort of like the traditional ones we think about like airfields, ports, things like that, there's also dual use sensing. And that can sort of be masked in terms of research and development collaborations at scientific institutions, universities. There was a particular case, I believe, in Sri Lanka of like a radar installation that was placed within a university that was ostensibly sort of a scientific sort of collaboration, but probably potentially had sort of other uses.
I'll just add a couple of other things that is of concern to India. One is what these loans, particularly that a number of these countries have taken from China, is doing to their debt burdens, and what sometimes the inability to pay those is leading to in terms of, for example, taking with the Chinese company taking over the port of Hambantota. So the terms of the agreements, what they're doing to debt burdens in these countries, but also then what that means in terms of the political and strategic influence that buys China within these countries. And India's concern in part has been is that China has used that influence to shape these countries' choices in terms of a more anti-India direction. And so not just in terms of, for example, getting them all to reiterate their one China policies, but also to actively curb their informing India or looping India in on things like a visit of a Chinese submarine, for example, or for instance, not just kind of lobbying for things that India is doing, lobbying against things that India is doing, but also the US. For example, we saw this with the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact with Nepal, where you actively saw China lobby against that and use disinformation and misinformation against India, but also against the US, Japan, and others.
Okay, one other question, which is a big question, and I know I only have 40 seconds, but can one of you, I'm not sure who the best person would be, kind of give a quick assessment of the current India-Russia relationship? It's my understanding that India, even before the agreement that was made, in the last few weeks on not purchasing more Russian oil, that only about 3% of India's oil comes from Russia. Can you just give a quick assessment of what that relationship is strategically and economically?
Russia will remain one of India's closest partners. It's not just nostalgia, there is a defense dependence, which Dr. Lalwani has written about, that will remain for a while, even though India has diversified largely away from Russia in recent years towards the US, France, Israel, South Korea, and others. So it will choose to maintain those relationships in different ways. They are trying to make it a more diversified relationship away from defense. Having said that, it's just the reality for India today that Russia is not as relevant to India's interests as it was in the past for various reasons, including it is not as essential for India's economic and technological transformation. And because of Russia's close partnership with China, that limits how much Russia can play a balancing role against China, not just in Eurasia, but in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Commissioner Hodges joining virtually.
Hi, good morning. Yes, this is a question for each of you. So you referenced India's continued orientation towards Russia, and given Beijing's widespread material support for Russian aggression in Europe, effectively underwriting the war, how do policymakers in New Delhi reconcile that with India's own security anxieties about Chinese power on its northern border? And does that contradiction shift the calculus structurally and create an opening for the U.S. to press India towards a cleaner break from those in Russia that are not pursuing peace?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. I would say that one of the things that has been least effective sometimes in terms of getting India to rethink where Russia fits in its strategy is when others tell India how to deal with Russia. One of the things that's been helpful is that India has recognized on its own that there are these limits to its Russia partnership because Russia is, for example, in the last Sino-Indian border crisis, Russia stayed neutral in that crisis. Unlike the US, Australia, and Japan, it did not actively come out in support of India. This is something India recognizes, that it will set limits because India sees and assesses most relationships today through a China prism. And so I think some of it is, as to the extent possible, sharing with India assessments and encouraging our European allies to share assessments of China-Russia relations, the depth and breadth of that relations, and potential implications for not just Sino-Russian cooperation in Eurasia, but potentially in the Indo-Pacific as well, where they have started doing more, for example, exercises with Iran, with South Africa, and others.
So I would
Thank you.
say, should I say three things real quick? So one, I mean, even go back to the previous question, the Russia-China relation, or the Russia relation with India. In terms of defense materiel, I still think that there are some narrow areas where India will continue with Russia, right? So air defense, missiles, cruise missiles, the BrahMos missile program really depends on sort of Russian ramjet propulsion. And the third would be a nuclear submarine, which the Russians are on schedule to provide the Indians a nuclear attack submarine. There's just no other alternative that India has right now. To Tanvi's point, I would add, the motto should be show, don't tell. I think there are real reasons for India to be concerned about the components going into future S-400 systems, both interceptor missiles as well as the radars. There's also real reasons to be concerned that China sort of has gotten into the back doors of that, or at least sort of knows the vulnerabilities of it, having operated it for many years. And I think it would be useful for us to sort of show an assessment of that as opposed to just sort of chiding India for it.
Thank you. I would just add, I think India's sort of idea of an omnidirectional foreign policy fundamentally relies on the belief that India can create a wedge between China and Russia. I think the increasing difficulty of India being able to do that is something that is going to be very challenging to break Indian policymakers of. And so I would also echo that I just think sharing information versus looking as if we are lecturing on the way of the world is a more effective approach with Indian partners. Second, I think we need to recognize that if we are wanting India to further diversify away from Russia, it will create real sense of vulnerability for India, that if the United States does not look like we are willing to step up in providing things militarily that we have not been able or willing to do in the past, we should have no expectation that India will want to walk away from what has been a very long-term relationship and military reliance. And then third, I do think there are some interesting areas, though. For example, the growing Pakistan-Russia relationship, as well as India's growing relationship with European partners who are not going to look very fondly on Indian ties with Russia, that also create opportunities for India to have a deeper understanding of how relationships with Russia are more complicated and fraught than in the past.
Thank you. No more questions.
All right, Commissioner Kuiken.
Ms. Ford, you actually just went where I wanted to have the whole panel go, which is the issue of Europe. We've talked a lot about Southeast Asia and how we're thinking about trying to persuade the Indians to diversify away from Russia. Can you talk about that, and can the whole panel talk about this in the context of Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, and sort of all of the countries right now that are reevaluating or thinking about their relationship with the U.S. and how we should look at through that through the India lens?
I think what you've been seeing, which a number of other countries have discovered now, but India has long had a strategy. It's perhaps the most consistent element of its foreign policy across governments of very different political stripes, to basically have a strategy of diversification when it comes to their foreign policy partnerships. And it is based on this understanding that while India would like to have its own independent capabilities, that it needs partners. And what it wants to do is diversify its dependence and make itself more resilient to, for instance, opportunities for coercion that countries might have. And so you've seen India long seek these relationships with others. They also think, whether it's Europe, whether it's Japan, whether it's other partners, having these countries be strong is essential to what they want in terms of a multipolar world. And so what you've seen in recent years is an acceleration. It did not start this year. You have seen it perhaps in the last, I think, 6 to 7 years, an acceleration of this diversification with Europe, with the UK now separately as well. You've seen it with Japan in the last few months. You've seen it with Korea. But you're also seeing it with countries that are in, for example, larger countries in Latin America and Africa as well, and in the Middle East. The UAE, for instance, has become a major partner for India. And part of this is saying you don't want there's something in common that a lot of these countries have. They are not China. So India is maintaining its relationship with China, but in India's diversified portfolio of partners, any hopes that China would grow have really been stemmed. And so you're seeing this diversification because they think these countries can help them not just kind of in terms of growing India's capabilities, but also helping them in their balancing strategy in the region, but also globally as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that India's relationship with Europe and sort of growing ties there have real advantages, but they also have a couple of limitations. First, I think Europe has taken a somewhat harder line than it has had in the past on China policy. But if Europe is going to look elsewhere other than China, especially economically on the industrial front, it frankly has to have a closer relationship with India. And so I think there are real advantages there in the closer manufacturing, economic, and trade ties that we see coming up right now between India and Europe. I think, quite frankly, it is also helpful because India has a very hard and realistic view of some of the technology challenges posed by Beijing that, frankly, it is sometimes helpful for our European partners to hear. India moved faster than everybody else on ripping China out of the telecom sector, out of social media apps, and I think in some ways that relationship can help harden Europe's spine when it comes to China policy. The relationship also, I think, provides a real military backstop for India in ways that can be helpful. Specifically, we look at the May 2025 crisis. India has a fighter gap problem. They know that, and they don't know how they're going to address it. The current effort both to work with France on co-development of jet engines as well as new purchases of French fighters will help India in that regard. And there are additional opportunities with the UK, with Germany, and other partners where maybe Europe can do things that the United States can't or won't right now. However, real limitations that I would say when it comes to thinking about the crises or conflicts at home that will matter most to India. A lot of European partners, I think, have reasonably close ties with Pakistan in ways that India finds problematic and difficult to reconcile. When we look at the India-China border situation, it's hard to imagine which European partner would actually step in to be helpful were there to be a crisis between India and China on the border. And then we look more broadly in the Indo-Pacific and all of China's military activities across the region that India finds problematic. And frankly, Europe has a limited ability militarily to step in and do something about it. So there are real areas where I think there is not a substitute for the United States for India.
Commissioner Brands, do you mind if we just let Mr. Lalwani answer?
I'll just add 2 points to that. So in terms of middle power cooperation, I think there's actually something really important happening between India and Japan that took place particularly on Prime Minister Modi's visit before he went to China in end of August. The substance of the defense cooperation agreement that's signed with Japan, including on radar and naval antenna technologies, I think presages sort of a greater sort of middle power collaboration. And the second point on Europe, I do think that India's industrial scale is going to be of great appeal to Europe as they try to spend more on defense procurement and defense manufacturing. India is going to be a natural partner. I think we're seeing that coming out of the trade agreement. And I would say that given that, we can allow Europe to sort of take the lead in sort of forcing the issue with India on its relationship with Russia, right? Europe has much higher stakes in this. I think they're going to be sharper about it, and they'll make very clear trade-offs in terms of sort of what the defense technology access potential is between the two. So I think in a way the United States could like sort of ride in Europe's wake on that conversation.
Thank you.
Commissioner Price.
Good morning. Thank you all for your excellent testimony this morning and for being here. So this week, in honor of Losar, Tibetan New Year, I'm going to ask a question related to Tibet. Dr. Lalwani, you mentioned it. Dr. Madan, you had it in your written testimony. And Ms. Ford, please feel free to give us your thinking also. As a succession discussion moves forward, it isn't if it is a problem, it's the Dalai Lama is 90, so I wish him many, many, many years to come, but he is a 90-year-old. Can you all address a bit security implications, domestic reverberations in India? Is India developing policy? Do they talk about policy? They've been very welcoming of the Dalai Lama and of the Tibetan community, but where all of that will evolve. Thank you.
I'll perhaps let Dr. Lalwani talk about the security implications. I would just say that I think, you've seen an India that has been thinking about this for years. What you rarely hear them do is talk about it. In fact, they're usually more discreet about this than even talking about Taiwan. And some of that is related to the fact that there is a sense that the last time the two countries fought a war in 1962, it was based in part of Chinese concerns about India's Tibet policy. So India tends to be quite, while it is very much focused on this issue, it realizes that it will have direct implications. They tend at least not to talk about it publicly. Having said that, there are certain things they've been quite consistent about, saying that Tibetans are welcome in India, saying that the only people who have the right to choose the next Dalai Lama are the Tibetans themselves, and no other country or capital has an interest. The other thing that politicians in India have to be sensitive about is that this has in the past been a sensitive issue. Parties still label previous governments as having caved to China on Tibet. And so there is a certain amount of attention that this issue gets in India that, for instance, Taiwan doesn't get. But because it is of direct implications to India, you see India at least having been hesitant to talk. One thing there has seemed to be a bit of change, though, in recent years is a willingness to engage with the US much more about this. And I think that is a good sign. I do think the US, India, and others have to start thinking about what the response will be when the question of succession comes up. You do see China very actively going and talking to countries that have a number of Buddhists or who would have interests, and potentially will try to get them to endorse whoever the Dalai Lama, whoever China decides to name as a successor. And I think it is important for like-minded countries to ensure that that does not happen.
Just add, in terms of what, in the event of the Dalai Lama's passing, I think there's plausible reason that you could see security measures being taken on either side of the border, just for, again, for defensive purposes or for protective purposes that could be misread, by the other side, and that sort of leads to sort of this conflict spiral of sorts, and particularly given the amount of forces pre-positioned that close to the border, including in close proximity to Tawang, another holy site for Tibetans, that it would, you could imagine a conflict spiral arising. And just to Tanvi's point, to add on to this, I do think this is something worth not just dialoguing on, and we certainly should be talking about sort of policy sort of in these scenarios, but also wargaming on. And that doesn't mean necessarily sort of military wargaming, but in terms of scenario exercises to figure out exactly sort of what are the potential contingencies that we need to be coordinating on in the future and potential uncertainties that arise.
Okay, Dr. Lalwani, can you go back to when you talk about wargaming? Can you get into some detail about what you're concerned about?
So I think I'll speak from sort of a previous game having played, that there are, if there's unrest on either side of the border, you can imagine forces being activated and moved forward. And in the past, the sort of forward deployment of forces has been misread as sort of aggression in some way. And then there's just a premium. There's a first mover advantage on this border in the Himalayas. And so what I would worry about is that. And I think it's sort of unlikely, but I still think it's the scenarios worth sort of teasing out the possibility that that first mover advantage creates an incentive for offensive mobilization.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shriver.
Thank you. Good morning. Really appreciate all the witnesses, your contributions to this hearing. This is really an all-star cast and a great opportunity for us to hear from you. I have a question for each that are unrelated to each other, if there's time, or if I need a second round. Dr. Lalwani, your comments about cooperation during a Taiwan contingency I found very interesting. I think it was a little more forward-leaning than what my expectations might be. But I'm wondering if that's something we should be more proactive on. I mean, I get it sort of conceptually. If there's a contingency, wouldn't it be great if India sort of tied down China in the Indian Ocean and held things at risk that would divert China's attention? But are we actually talking to the Indians about this? Are we actually planning and doing the wargaming and the scenario discussions? And would the Indians even know what the expectations might be? Are they training to it? Are they equipping to it? Or are we just at this very sort of nascent stage of conceptually, this is what sounds good to us, but we haven't really pushed it?
I don't work for the U.S. government. I talk to them about it, and I do think that I can't speak for how the U.S. government sort of approaches this conversation, but I do think it would behoove us to do so, because I do see India's public debates on this moving at a pace that I would not have expected 5 years ago. And so, yeah, there are these different scenarios out there that are hypothesized. I think we should be exploring different ones. I think some are more likely than others. I think sort of maybe more passive things like logistics and overflight and over the horizon, technology support like satellite support are more plausible than sort of opening up a second front. But I think there are things that in between that could be of substantial benefit to the U.S. Again, covering down the Indian Ocean, I think, has many forms. And so, yes, I do think we should be talking about it. I'm not certain we are.
Well, you're seated next to somebody who may have been involved in that, but and welcome any comment you might have on that, Ms. Ford. But wanted to ask you a question about one of your recommendations about defense industrial cooperation. I mean, I feel like this is a bit of an iceberg I've been staring at for a couple decades, and it tends to go in the same direction every time. India wants technology transfer, U.S. industry wants the sales, and again, you were sounded a little bit more optimistic than maybe I would have been in terms of how this might unfold going forward. Am I characterizing your view correctly? And if so, how can you make me a little more optimistic?
Yeah, I think I am overall optimistic, because I think we have learned some lessons from stuff that has not worked in the past. That we have an opportunity to do differently. The reason that I focused on IndusX, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator, is specifically because the premise there was that we were going to focus on dual-use technologies that would have commercial applications as well as military applications. That explicitly means that you're going to be working with private sector Indian companies, and you're going to be talking about sort of near-term wins and gains when it comes to defense tech. I think that's really important. In the past, where we have gone wrong almost every single time, is we put big U.S. defense primes up against Indian private sector SOEs, and they just don't work together. And we focused on ambitious projects that would take like 10 to 20 years to materialize. And so both sides kind of threw up their hands at some point in that process and decided nothing is working. So short, discrete, commercial tech that has a broader application, I think, is the way to go. And India's defense and tech community has enough startups now that is more possible than I think it has been in the past.
Thank you. I'll try to squeeze the third one in, Dr. Madan. There hasn't been much discussion about the strategic landscape with respect to nuclear capabilities. And we're in an environment now that could change quite rapidly with the ending of the START agreement with Russia, with China surging to maybe 1,000 warheads, according to the Department of Defense, with Undersecretary of State Donato just saying a few weeks ago that China was conducting low-yield underground tests. So how do the Indians view the landscape with respect to strategic weapons, and how's that affecting their thinking and their own modernization plans, et cetera?
I think, some of this is hard to know from the outside. Another subject they tend not to talk about. You have seen discussions in the last number of years about whether or not India should be reviewing its doctrine. You've also seen the strengthening of the triad. But I think there's also been this sense that when India, you're hearing a lot about the idea that as countries talk about strategic stability, that having, there's often kind of moving on from US Russia to US China, that India should be at the table as well, because there is a domino effect in terms of decisions that China is making, which might be focused on the US. India then has to respond to. So even recognizing that China's nuclear program is not just or even primarily about India, that those will have implications for India. Just one couple of things on the Taiwan question and why it is essential, I think, to have this discussion. If there's not a discussion between India and the US on Taiwan scenarios, this will set the relationship up more broadly for disappointment, because there will be misaligned expectations. And so I think it is important, and I think this would be facilitated by the fact that, as Dr. Lalwani indicated, there's been a lot more understanding in India that, thanks in part to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that this is an actual reality. But second, that what happens in the Western Pacific won't stay in the Western Pacific and will have implications for India. So sitting on the fence is not really an option when this is closer to home as well.
Commissioner Shmavonian.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Lalwani. Can you talk through the risks for India and other downstream countries of China's damming of the headwaters of the Tibetan Plateau and how that may be leveraged?
I'm truly sorry, Commissioner. I don't have any particular expertise on this area, so I would just be filibustering. I apologize.
No worries. Anyone else want to take that?
Yeah, I can just add the concern that India has had has everything. There have been environmental concerns. There have been concerns about diversion of river waters. The Brahmaputra goes through some of the most populated parts of the country. There are also concerns that this can be used down the line, and India, even in the middle of this re-engagement process that they've been undergoing in the last 6 to 8 months, has expressed deep concern about the announcement of a new large dam that the Chinese have announced that they will be building. There is a concern about potential coercion, though there has been various studies that indicate that India would not be as adversely affected as some might indicate if, for example, China uses kind of water as a weapon, so to speak. So there are some mixed views about that. People talk about large portions of that river being rain-fed when it comes to the Indian sections. Having said that, you have seen, and India has acknowledged, that in the last 2 crises, you did see China stop sharing hydrological data during these crises. And so that was read as China indicating that it would actually at least use parts of this issue during security crises between the 2 countries.
Great, thank you. This question is for anyone on the panel, but I think we'll start with Ms. Ford, and this has been hinted at through a couple of responses. I'm interested in further exploring the India-Pakistan relationship and how that informs or shapes the India-China relationship, the India-Russia relationship, India's relationships with other potential strategic partners.
I think that the way we need to think about the India-Pakistan relationship today is the more that India is forced to focus on its border with Pakistan and with both deterring and responding to cross-border attacks coming out of Pakistan, the less bandwidth that it has to focus on what I think most Indian policymakers would tell you is really the more existential strategic threat that they face, and that is the one from China. And so what concerns me about the situation we're in right now is that coming out of May 2025, India is looking at emergency procurements, it is thinking about where it puts its forces, and the more that those are on one border, there are some pretty zero-sum trade-offs with what it can do on the other border. There are also real differences in kinds of force structure and capability it needs to deal with Pakistan versus what it needs to deal with China. And so I think in a lot of ways, Indian policymakers would probably acknowledge that Pakistan is not the existential threat that China is, but it is also a political reality that they can't afford to ignore. And so they have to deal with that near-term situation and get that border more stable in order to be able to focus on Beijing.
I just add on the Pakistan-Russia issue. One of the things that India would be deeply concerned about, and has indicated that it would be, is not just Russia moving from neutral to taking China's side in an India-China crisis, but also the coming together of Russia, China, Pakistan. So when we worry here about an axis that involves China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they worry about, at times they've worried about China, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, less so now because of the Taliban's differences with the Pakistani government. They have worried about China, Russia, North Korea, Pakistan. And so for them, they partly engage, one of the reasons for engaging and maintaining ties with the Russians is to ensure that that China-Russia-Pakistan alignment doesn't come about. China has actively, and the Pakistani leader at the time, Imran Khan, was in Russia the week of the Russian invasion, and he publicly said that that visit was facilitated by the Chinese. This is the kind of thing India worries about, and it's also the kind of thing that Russia actually uses to try to keep India on side.
Thank you.
Commissioner Slevin.
Thank you, and thanks to our witnesses. I'd like to pick up on Commissioner Shmimonian's last questions as well as it relates to the May 2025 conflict, maybe starting with Dr. Lalwani. You alluded to questions that New Delhi is asking since then and maybe certain assumptions that were broken and that the support from the Chinese was material and digital as well. So I invite all the panel to respond, but maybe starting with Dr. Lalwani. Do you see this as having been a more episodic event, responding to a specific set of circumstances, a terrorist attack? Do you see it suggesting more of an aggressive posture on the part of India? And with that, what kinds of questions do you think are derived from those questions?
So to the last question about whether it's episodic, I actually think this is a trajectory, but I think the trajectory is on the Chinese side, where you're starting to see greater involvement in picking a side. There were about 25 years ago, China would be following sort of the U.S. lead in terms of calling for de-escalation or ceasefires or mediation in some ways. And I think today we are seeing China more and more putting its thumb on the scale in this conflict. And it goes to the previous question and point, which is that it is in China's interest to see India diverted to the Pakistan border specifically, and so diverted away from not only the northern border with China, but also from the Indian Ocean. So there's a utility to India being quote unquote bogged down or contained within the South Asian subcontinent rather than sort of being a maritime power. I do think in this case it was a stepwise jump in terms of China's involvement. I think all Indian analysts and officials recognize China's materially benefited and enabled Pakistan's military from sort of nuclear technology, enrichment missiles, to now sort of a wide range of advanced military hardware. But I think its active involvement, its live involvement, particularly through radars and sensors and intelligence and even guidance, I think was a surprise to the Indians and presaged something far more challenging in the future that they're trying to prepare for.
I would add, I guess, that, India has often talked about sort of the notion of like a two-front crisis as like the real existential threat that it could potentially face. And I think that post-May 2025, it looks like that is now here. That is not a tomorrow problem. That is a today problem for India. And one thing I would say is that in the same way that the United States often tries to say to Indian colleagues, like, hey, this wedge strategy that you have with China and Russia is not actually going to work the way that you think. I think Indian counterparts say to the United States, hey, this wedge strategy that you think you're trying to run with Pakistan, between Pakistan and China, is not going to play out in the way that you think. And I do think that the Pakistan relationship with China today is so much further advanced than what it was a decade ago. It behooves the United States to interrogate a little more the degree to which some of the things that Indian colleagues raise as concerns, whether that's tactics, training, and procedures that Pakistan could pick up from Western countries flowing eventually into China, or whether that's inadvertent tech flowing from Pakistan into China. It behooves the United States and other Western countries to actually interrogate those questions a little more.
Would you agree with that, Dr. Lalwani?
Absolutely. And I do think that there are certain aspects that we should be asking ourselves and our partners. There's one area where the Indians have pointed out where they believe that the Pakistanis were able, or the Chinese were able to stitch data links between Chinese fighter jets, Swedish AWACS systems, and potentially even U.S. originated ground radars. And that should be a concern to all of us if the Chinese are getting into those data links.
Dr. Madan?
I just add one thing. A dimension that didn't necessarily play out, but could in this crisis, but could in the next, is the naval side. And that is another space where China it doesn't get as much attention, but China is actively modernizing Pakistan's naval forces as well, just delivered another submarine to the Pakistanis. And so this will not stay on the continent. It will eventually involve a maritime domain, which also goes to that point that if we want India focusing on China, and we have long argued that it needs to think about the maritime space, partly because it has certain advantages there, is China will seek to actually impinge on those advantages, but also that the more China can hold India down on the continental side, the less India will be able to do itself in the maritime side. And China, and it's not just a China story there, it's a Pakistan one as well.
Thank you. Commissioner.
So we have a few minutes left if people have second round questions. I have one, just catch my eye if you have one as well. So let me actually just want to pick up on this subject. So Dr. Lalwani, in your written testimony, you talked about the potential for an Indian offset strategy to deal with the two-front dilemma. What does that look like, and does it have any implications for the defense relationship with the U.S.?
It certainly can. I think that there are at least sort of three ideas I've pulled from, again, public debates that are in literature. One is just sort of thinking about how to lean more on nuclear forces to offset Chinese advantages, particularly on the LAC. This is sort of an idea that has floated in the past. I don't think it's really that serious, but it could be a direction India goes. The second is just greater military spending. That doesn't necessarily mean like a strategic offset strategy, but there have been parliamentarians who've said maybe we need to just be spending 4% of GDP. Again, I think it's highly unlikely, but that conversation, I think, could start to percolate. And you certainly saw in the last defense budget a significant increase in capital expenditures that I haven't seen in a long time. The third is leaning on partners, or I would call them alliances, or proto-alliances. But I think that there's an urgency that India sees now, given sort of the state of the China-Pakistan threshold alliance that they need to offset. And so that, I think, opens the door, not just the United States, but as I said, middle powers as well.
All right, Commissioner Kagan, and then Commissioner Price, and then Commissioner Slevin.
Thank you, Commissioner Brands. I have two questions I'll put to the panel. I'll throw the questions out right up front so we can burn through my time before Commissioner Brands gets me in trouble. Industrial capacity. The last time I was in India, one of the things that just absolutely is striking is the industrial capacity of the country. And so I asked that question in the context of co-production and tech transfer, or both. One of the things you hear when you're in India is they always want co-production or they want tech transfer, and this is one of the sort of common tension points in all the discussions that relate to the defense industrial base, or even civilian aerospace and some of the other areas where we have an economic relationship that has a lot of potential but hasn't been fully tapped. Can you each just talk about the sort of tensions between tech transfer, co-production, or both, and then also comment, and you have sort of in passing, but very directly on the idea of industrial capacity and sort of how we should evaluate that in the context of a U.S.-China relationship and dynamic.
So I think I'll just speak to this question mainly from the defense perspective, I think there are things that both the United States and India need to do here. So specifically, I think that the United States can probably be more forward-leaning than we have been in the past when it comes to tech transfer. Honestly, that's not just true with India. That's probably true in a lot of places. And I think it behooves the State Department, the Defense Department, to look more specifically at some of the capabilities that Indian counterparts have asked for in the past and do an updated risk assessment and see if the decision today still lands in the same place, because I think there are areas where we could lean farther forward. From India's perspective, I think it needs to recognize a couple of things if it wants this tech transfer and it wants to do co-production. One, the United States is going to demand, essentially, that if you want the crown jewels of U.S. technologies, there are certain things when it comes to your own tech security or how you use and employ those capabilities in the future that we're going to want to get a vote in. India has not always wanted to do that in the past. And then the second thing, I think pacing. India has a lot of industrial capacity, but they don't always have the ability to immediately move to co-production as quickly as they would like. And so sometimes Indian counterparts need to be more comfortable with a ramp toward that co-production than they have sometimes been.
I would just add to this. I think that refrain that I also have been tracking for a decade or so usually came from the public sector, as Lindsey said, state-owned enterprises. And they oftentimes was either in bad faith or sort of out of like a misunderstanding of how technology transfers occur and what the potential for co-production are. I think the private sector has become much more welcomed in the Indian defense ecosystem. You're seeing that be very explicit. The Indian government has said the fifth generation fighter will be led by a private sector entity. It's the first time that, and I think that was a real shock to the system. So I do think there's more openings for a more reasonable business case to be made with the U.S. private sector and the Indian private sector. I think U.S. primes are actually very interested in this. There are a lot of U.S. primes that are in India right now that do see opportunities for scaling their business and exports and defense sales through co-production. The hang-up, I think, has also come at sometimes on the U.S. side in terms of technology release, like either license decisions or services or service deciding or uncertain about sort of whether they want to transfer this. So it would probably require some more political push, but I do think the business case is now much clearer.
I would just add that I think the broader tension for India in this space is the same as its broader tension even when it comes to industrial capacity beyond the defense side, which is how much to actually open up to build capacity versus wanting kind of indigenous capacity, and this kind of how much to open up and how much to just develop indigenous capacity. This debate about self-reliance is a constant. Having said that, you have seen change. You will see it on the ground, even in terms of Indian companies and joint U.S.-India joint ventures becoming integral parts of American defense companies' supply chains. Now, the example I like to give is that the empennages of every one of the C-130s produced in the world is now produced in India. I don't think that would have been possible, but it's also shown it can be done. I think you've also seen a shift in the debate in terms of saying technology transfer ideally, but otherwise the importance of knowledge transfer and thinking about, and even knowledge sharing, given that in some of the new critical and emerging technology spaces, it's actually sometimes India that has these capabilities, even some of the startups which both Ms. Ford and Dr. Lalwani have worked with, who are actually developing some of these capabilities for US companies and the Defense Department as well.
Commissioner Price.
Thank you. Last year, the Commission spent a good amount of time talking about Southeast Asia, and in our travel and discussions here, there was a huge concern about transnational crime. And it wasn't something any of you raised, but I'd love to hear your opinion or any kind of discussion that you've had, if you have had, on that issue, and how big of a problem is that between China and what the Chinese in India. Thanks.
I'll just say something real quick because I remember my colleague, former colleague Jason Tower was one of the people who testified on this, and my recollection is that there was a fair number of Indian nationals who have been, kidnapped in these call centers or these scam centers, and so I do think at the very least this would be a useful point of discussion between the U.S. and India on how we can sort of collaborate on counteracting that, because I do think the Indian government will be very concerned about sort of its own citizens being held hostage in these situations.
I think along with that issue, and it's played out with Indians in Cambodia most recently, it is a subject that the Indian government has been following, but also having to try to get some of these Indians released. The other issue, along with kind of some of these scam centers, is there have been instances of Chinese apps that have been kind of been used in India to try and scamming Indians of money mostly there, and you have seen the Indian Home Ministry actually try to crack down on this in recent years. So I think those are the two big areas you've really seen on this issue that there has been a problem.
Ms. Ford, anything to add? Okay. Also want to talk about disinformation, involvement in elections or involvement in just trying to change public opinion. Have you done any research in that area as well?
So one of the things that you've seen some collaboration in at least Chinese and Pakistani entities during crises. But one of the things that has been noticeable is I don't think China is actually very effective, or that India's fertile ground for this as much. The Russians, frankly, do a better job. They understand the Indian psyche far more. They tend to amplify Chinese messages through their platforms, etc. Some Chinese platforms are not allowed there in India. One of the reasons, and several years ago, even before the India-China border crisis, you saw India ban certain Chinese browsers that came as default browsers on, at that time, most phones that were being used in India were produced in China. They were actually manipulating search results according to Chinese preferences. And you saw the Indian government, after reading an American study, actually ban some of those browsers. So I think here too, as has been said by others, I think information sharing in terms of the biggest concerns and what we're seeing in other places would be helpful. But you're seeing attempts at this, but I think you've also seen at the same time, both Chinese platforms tend to either not have access or be as welcome. But also I think, because of the broader India-China tensions, they don't have as much kind of, you just don't see them as effective as maybe in other spaces. One other area I would say that's worth watching in this space, you do see China very actively trying to shape media in India, including through, for example, using social media. TikTok is banned in India, but other platforms taking Indian influencers. So it might not be kind of disinformation and stuff, but they are trying to shape the narrative and even do things like, for example, attract Indian engineers or high-skilled workers to go to China, for instance, and actively saying that, you've been chucked out of the US, why don't you come to China instead?
Thank you.
Commissioner Slevin.
I'll try to pick up on that a little bit, but Ms. Ford, I think in response to Commissioner Brands, you talked earlier about some of the last year, some frictions and weight maybe given to some voices among Indian policymakers about the U.S.-India relationship. I was wondering if you could invite the rest to comment, what's the debate like among Indian policymakers as it relates to the threat from China? Is there consensus? Is there real debate? And how does this narrative shifting that you just alluded to, Dr. Madan, influence any of the politics?
I think that I think there is probably a good degree of alignment in India's sort of strategic thinking community about the nature of the China threat. I actually think in all of the conversations I had in government with Indian counterparts, they had some of the most clear-eyed perspectives about the nature of the threat from Beijing that were pretty aligned with where we were in the United States most of the time. I think where the debate is in India is what to do about it. And so where I think there have been, as Dr. Madan said, a lot of folks within the Indian government, the strategic thinking community, who've been arguing that that necessitated a closer defense partnership with the United States. I think today, both because of what has happened on the US-India trade front, but also because, quite frankly, India is not quite sure where US policy is going toward China. There is an increasing amount of conversation about diversifying elsewhere, whether that's to Europe, as well as thinking about what needs to happen in the Russia relationship in the future. And so that's where I think the risk is.
Just add that what you see is kind of the debate. Also, I think the two areas of debate are kind of not that China is a threat, but the urgency and the immediacy. Sometimes it's, for example, is the border going to flare up again? What are China's intentions? And as Ms. Ford said, how to approach it. The one other kind of broader area where you are seeing a debate, and it's pretty fast moving because it changes, is on how much to and where and how to selectively economically re-engage with China. Because, as mentioned kind of in opening remarks, that there are certain places where India, both for its civilian kind of desire to build up manufacturing capacity, but also in kind of broadly to become part of global supply chains, to open up to China, both in terms of industrial inputs as well as kind of technical expertise. In fact, it's sometimes American companies saying to India, we want you to enable more economic ties with China. So I think the dilemma for India in that, and that you do hear a debate, is how much, where, because they want to take advantage of this for their own growth. Having said that, their dilemma still is that they deeply worry about kind of overdependence on China, and you're seeing them actively try to diversify away, as I'm sure the next panel will talk about. I think one other thing, though, I think as you see this debate, as Ms. Ford said, India watches US-China relations very, very closely because it shapes what they think will happen in India-China relations, because they think China sees India through a US prism in part. So they're deeply concerned whenever there's talk of US-China engagement, just like we have concerns sometimes when we see India engaging with China. But I will say, when we talk about what in India hedging, there is no debate about India hedging between the US and China anymore. Where India is hedging and has been hedging is hedging against overdependence on the US and on uncertainty about the US. And I think you've seen that accelerate, but this does not mean India will walk a middle path, or that there's any debate about India walking a middle path between US and China.
I'll just add on one sort of small sliver of this, which is on artificial intelligence. I generally think that the Indian state has been very careful about trying to keep India out of digital infrastructure. There's a kind of a middle ground space on something like connected vehicles, where despite the fact that, as far as I can tell, there's been no joint production in India, there's still a lot of BYD vehicles being sold throughout India. So there might be some risk in connected vehicles that I haven't sort of really fully explored. But the area that I think should be of concern is Chinese LLMs, right? Sort of enterprise use of open source DeepSeek models in applications, because it is being used. There's no regulation of this. It's hard to obviously regulate even in the United States. And we don't fully sort of know what the scope or risk of that is, but I think that's something that we should be showing more attentive to.
Great, thank you.
Quick one from Commissioner Stivers.
Oh, I hope this is quick, but I want to zoom out for a minute here. I think the U.S.-India relationship, I think the formal name is a comprehensive global strategic partnership, which sounds like a lot of word salad to me. But despite all the mutual interests and strong relationships between the people of the U.S. and India, there's still a lot of reasons why there's not a formal alliance with India. I think Ms. Ford, I think you said there will never be a formal alliance between the U.S. and India. If a new administration were to come in, or even this administration, and they wanted to make India their top priority, what, in a big scheme of things, what is a big idea that the U.S. could offer India that they would care about the most? Would it be breaking relationships with Pakistan or something like that? Or what would they want that would be a big thing that could really build trust between the U.S. and India?
I think we already had this in a sense, and we have tossed it a little bit by the wayside at the moment. So the logic of the Biden administration creating ISET, which was the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, was, I think, a recognition that what India cared most about was when it came to a handful of emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, quantum, more rapidly advancing its own industrial capacity at home, and that it needed a partnership with the United States to do that. And we were willing to lean into helping India do that because in a lot of ways we're also frankly really dependent on Indian talent, engineering and design talent, to advance those sectors ourselves. So to me, we had the big idea, which I think both countries still have an interest in working on, but it's been somewhat paralyzed for the last year, despite the fact that the Trump administration, renamed it and said that we were going to continue to work on these areas together. So I think we kind of need to pick up what we already had.
Yeah, I think 5 years ago we could have said compute and semiconductors, and I do think that the last administration moved big on that. And I think the private sector is already doing it now. So there's probably a missed opportunity for government to kind of claim credit for it, right? There was $67.5 billion in committed investments in data centers in India last fall that I would have loved to see the United States government be at the front end of that message. In terms of defense, though, I think something similar to the guided munitions program that we're doing with Australia would be a really great value to India. We don't have an offensive strike capability that we've jointly developed. This is the thing that the Indians point to with the Russians all the time. They're the ones who worked with us on a BrahMos cruise missile, which then played out fairly well in the recent war with Pakistan last May. And I do think India does need more long-range strike options if it wants to hold China at risk.
I think beyond the specifics, I think two broader things would be helpful. Is one, taking that convergence in China and on shared visions of the Indo-Pacific and taking that to drive cooperation. The governments tend to deny this is about China, but what that strategic convergence on China has done is drive that deeper cooperation, I would argue, even alignment, and it has helped the two sides manage those differences, which are going to continue to exist on Russia and Pakistan. And so I think convergence in China and making sure that at the very least both sides are read in on each other's policy. I think second is just consistency. I think the thing across the board is just consistency, because that is the argument not just Russia makes to India, but even European countries like France, is that that we are going to be a consistent partner, and so you see India then signing certain deals or working with France in certain ways that it perhaps is not the case with us. So I think consistency on our part, not just in terms of US policy towards India, but US policy towards China as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been terrific, and I'm sure we could keep mining your insights for another couple of hours, but I'll just close things out by saying thank you again. We will reconvene after a 10-minute break for panel number 2.
Good mid-morning. I think we'll start a few minutes early since we have everyone here. Our second panel today will examine India and China's bilateral economic relations. India is an alternative investment destination for companies seeking to move production out of China, and India is a partner to the United States in critical emerging technologies. We'll begin with Dr. Bhowmick. Excuse me if I make any of the pronunciations wrong, and please feel free to correct. He is a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Dr. Bhowmick's work focuses on India's economic relations with China and the broader region. He will provide testimony on cross-border trade and investment dynamics and the economic statecraft efforts both India and China have utilized in the relationship. Next, we'll hear from Tarun Chhabra, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Previously, he served as deputy assistant to the president and coordinator for technology and national security at the National Security Council. His testimony will explore India's AI and semiconductor ecosystem, India as a China +1 destination for technology investment, and U.S.-India government initiatives to enhance defense and technology partnerships. And then we'll hear from Dr. Chan Harjivan, a visiting fellow at Duke University's Margolis Institute for Health Policy. Dr. Harjivan has more than 25 years of experience spanning public health, government, and the biopharmaceutical industry. He has worked at the White House as a special assistant to the president and with leadership of nearly every major pharmaceutical company. His testimony will pertain to India's position in the pharmaceutical supply chains and biotechnology innovation landscape. Thank you all very much for your testimony. I'd like to remind all of our witnesses to please keep their marks to 7 minutes to preserve time for questions. And Dr. Bhowmick, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Co-Chair Brands, scribers, and distinguished members of the Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. I offer my remarks today in my personal capacity as an India-based policy researcher focused on globalization, economics, and diplomacy. Well, in the Indo-Pacific today, the most consequential context is not only over the lines on a map, but over who can keep factories running, networks trusted, and supply chains resilient under strategic stress. In the last financial year, India-China merchandise trade reached a record high of $128 billion, with a trade deficit of approximately $100 billion. China also accounted for 16% of India's total imports, and these figures highlight the fact that China, for India, is not just a marginal trading partner, but it is a system-scale supplier whose inputs are deeply embedded in Indian production. The most China-reliant segments for India are not just consumer goods, they are upstream enablers of industrialization, such as electronic components, sub-assemblies, industrial machinery, chemicals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, etc. And in these critical sectors, Indian policymakers and businesses have shown a bit of concern over the lack of reciprocity in trade with China over the years, especially more than tariff barriers, but instead non-tariff barriers in the sense of processes, friction, delays, documentations, which essentially increase the transaction costs of trade with China. India's approach, therefore, is not just trade and security as two different boxes. It is more of managed interdependence under strategic competition, which essentially means keeping commercial channels functional where they support growth and upgrading, but also tightening guardrails around sensitive nodes. A key point for the Commission is to understand the fact that trade deficit with China is not seen as a moral failing for India. It just becomes strategically salient when scale, composition, and concentration intersect. A large persistent trade gap and increasing trade gap over the years with China does indicate capability deficit to a large extent. And at the same time, India also recognizes the fact that these trade deficits is essentially a structural constraint that affects the entire Indo-Pacific, where China is not merely a seller of finished goods, but it remains a central upstream processing and component hub. Now, in terms of alternating suppliers and moving some of the assembly, it is a rather immediate, it's kind of impossible to find an immediate ability to replace China-linked upstream inputs at scale at the moment. Now, since 2020, India's policy response to China-related exposure have been rather layered than absolute. Both security and espionage concerns alongside growth needs. On the investment front, India has tightened screening for investors from countries sharing land borders with India. The point is not a blanket ban, but also higher security in sensitive cases, such as digital platforms, data-rich applications, leading to the fact that 59 apps were banned in 2020. There has also been some tightening permissions in power equipment, especially during heightened tensions between India and China. Well, in retrospect, it also helps to understand that this kind of tightening and making the technology climate more compatible with the technology direction that India is going towards has helped in the AI transformation that the country is witnessing right now. As we speak before the Commission today, India hosts the AI Impact Summit, the largest AI summit which is hosted by any Global South country at the moment, and the conversations that range from safety to implementation in AI. Now, coming to the question if India can meaningfully reduce dependence on China, the answer is yes, but only if it is understood as a medium-term capability and ecosystem project, not a short-term political slogan. The production-linked incentive framework reflects that logic across multiple sectors where India not only wants to enhance domestic capability, but also increase export competitiveness through these kind of policies. Looking ahead, the most likely trajectory for India-China economic relationship is neither clean decoupling nor full return to business as usual. It is continued selective de-risking with tactical stabilization. Where relationships improve, it is more likely through calibrated low-risk steps such as commercial connectivity, dialogue mechanisms, etc., rather than wholesale rollback of post-2020 screenings. The most durable US approach is to deepen cooperation with India in ways that expands the menu of credible options, treating resilience as a shared strategic objective by reducing choke point dependence in electronic inputs, pharmaceutical supplies, clean chain components. It also means that technology cooperation that is scalable and predictable, so through mechanisms like ISET becomes pipelines for joint R&D. Export control practice also remains crucial with partnership realities by maximizing predictability and minimizing transaction costs. It also means managing sanctions and the current trade frictions that India and the US have currently been witnessing. Deepening defense industrial cooperation remains another major segment. And finally, it also means building a joint playbook for supply chain shocks that we currently experience in the volatile world that we live in. The recommendations to the Congress draws from the essence of my testimony, which means that India plans to look at managing interdependence with China, again, under strategic competition. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Mr. Chhabra.
Thank you, co-chairs and commissioners. It's great to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I come to this hearing's topic from the vantage of having worked in the U.S. government to try to strengthen U.S.-India technology and security ties. While serving on the National Security Council staff, I worked to conceive and launch the initiative on critical and emerging technologies in 2022 and 2023, which established, as you know, a framework for U.S.-India cooperation across semiconductors, artificial intelligence, civil nuclear energy, and many other sectors. This framework, of course, was succeeded by the Trump administration's Trust framework. These initiatives, I think, are critical because India represents the single most important swing state in our global technology competition with the Chinese Communist Party. These choices that India will make over the next decade about its technology ecosystem will fundamentally shape whether the broader Indo-Pacific operates within a US-led democratic technology ecosystem or a CCP-led authoritarian one. We have a foundational interest, in my view, in shaping those choices. So let me touch on 4 areas this morning: India as a scale market for US companies, 2, sectoral opportunities in nuclear energy, defense, biotech, and AI and semiconductors, 3, the importance of aligning trusted technology standards between the 2 countries, and 4, a rough framework for addressing US concerns regarding India's relations with Russia versus China. First, India is a scale market for US companies. The strategic partnership with India is about both allied scale to compete with China, as well as our commercial competitiveness in what will be the world's most consequential growth market in the next couple decades. The Trump administration's interim framework announced on trade in February represents a step forward here in that both countries have committed to substantially increasing trade in technology products, including AI chips for data centers and expanding joint technology cooperation. And the logic here is powerful. India is the only market on earth that combines more than 1.4 billion consumers, a rapidly expanding digital economy, and broad alignment with the United States on the China challenge. US companies operating at scale in India embed trusted American technology standards in Indian infrastructure. They scale revenue needed to compete with China's technology companies globally, and they expand markets globally with trusted supply chains. Let me speak a bit about sectoral opportunities. With respect to civil nuclear cooperation, this is an area that has been at once one of the most celebrated and under-realized opportunities in the US-India relationship, and one where China competition is very relevant. There's now finally movement in this sector thanks to actions taken in 2024 and 2025 by both the Trump and Biden administrations. But China and Russia are already competing aggressively in this space, particularly with respect to small modular reactors. And American companies in this sector need scaled purchase commitments to bring prices down and to compete globally. Congress should press both governments on a timeline for resolving remaining barriers, including on the question of nuclear liability. With respect to defense sales, which you heard about in the last panel, I would say it's evolving definitely in the right direction, but the pace needs to accelerate given the urgency of the strategic environment. We should prioritize first co-production of crown jewel technologies, such as the GE Aerospace engine deal that's being finalized. This represents, I think, some of the most deep technology cooperation we have offered to a non-treaty ally and would enable India to become the first country to produce advanced jet engines, joining the United States, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. But in certain contingencies, as all of you know, mass, cheap, attritable drones, loitering munitions, and distributed sensors could matter as much as exquisite platforms. The Autonomous Systems Industry Alliance, launched during the Prime Minister's trip to Washington last year, has a compelling logic. The United States brings cutting-edge autonomy, AI, software-defined warfare capabilities, and India brings manufacturing scale, engineering talent, and complex operational environments for testing and refinement. Again, I think Congress could push for an execution roadmap with measurable milestones. I will not spend as much time on biotech and pharmaceutical supply chains, since we have a former colleague who's a deep expert in that area, but let me say a word about semiconductors and AI. Semiconductors and AI represent the most consequential arenas of US-China technology competition, and India's trajectory in both sectors could materially shape the balance of power given the strategic significance of AI. US policy must be to reshore to the United States far more semiconductor manufacturing than we are currently projected to achieve. But we should look to support allies and strategic partners like India for production that is unlikely to be reshored, especially where the likely alternative could be China. India is also an AI application layer powerhouse, the country or countries that figure out how to deliver AI-powered diagnostics to 800 million rural Indians or AI-driven crop advisories to 150 million farmers could set de facto global standards for how AI is deployed across the developing world. India is pursuing semiconductor manufacturing, a data center build-out, and AI application layer investment as an integrated stack for the United States. This represents a significant commercial and strategic opportunity. One of the most strategically significant and least discussed opportunities in the US-India partnership is the alignment of information and communications technology services security policies that could create a common market for trusted technology. But these efforts, I believe, remain largely uncoordinated. The strategic opportunity is to align the US and Indian ICTS restrictions on PRC origin connected vehicles, telecommunications equipment, and other network goods and services, not only for fully valid security reasons, but also to create the foundation of a common market for trusted technology. ICTS barriers effectively operate as an extremely prohibitive tariff. If the US and India apply such barriers implemented through consistent standards for what constitutes a trusted ICTS vendor, they create a combined market of nearly 2 billion people operating within a shared technology framework. And that's without bringing in other like-minded democracies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and our European allies. This is an enormously powerful tool and particularly an important incentive for US, Indian, and allied technology companies to build products to a common standard. An understandable but consequential analytical error in US policy toward India is a tendency to treat Russia and China in a single bucket of demands, but they are different. On Russia, the United States must press India to wind down inherited dependencies while winding up alternatives. The ask on China is different and should be much more ambitious. For the reasons that were made clear in the previous panel, the opportunity here is pragmatic, persistent, step-by-step confidence building, a series of strategic plays that builds momentum, trust, and resilience. I'll leave it at that and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Harjivan.
Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd also like to thank my wife and son for joining me here in person and my daughter online. Leadership in biotechnology and the security of America's medicine supply is no longer a narrow health policy issue. It has become an urgent core question of economic certainty, technological leadership, and strategic resilience. Beijing and New Delhi planned and invested over the long term and now shape the development, availability, and affordability of essential medicines relied upon daily by the American public, the US military, and in fact, the world. Let me frame my discussion in three facts. First, China dominates the upstream. China dominates the upstream, India the downstream. If China restricts the exports of critical inputs, ripple effects cascade into India's manufacturing base and ultimately into US pharmacies. It's a single point of failure network that jeopardizes patient care and national security. Number two, the United States does not lack manufacturing capability. It lacks economic alignment. Margins are razor thin for generics. Quality investment is under-rewarded. Redundancy is economically irrational under current payment models. So concentration and vulnerability persist. Third, the US and its democratic allies must lead the biotechnology revolution that is underway. Together, AI is turning biology into programmable infrastructure, accelerating innovation while strengthening resilience. McKinsey predicts biological innovations could impact up to 60% of physical inputs into the global economy. This is not a China versus India versus US story. India is both a strategic partner and a structural choke point. China is both a low-cost manufacturing powerhouse and a geopolitical competitor. Both have made medicines cheaper and thus more accessible globally. The question for the US policy is not how to decouple completely, but how to de-risk and lead. Let me turn to my three recommendations. Recommendation number one, and this is so simple: greater visibility into the supply chain and paying for resilience. Congress should amend existing law to require manufacturers to report Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers for medicines. These mechanisms need not be burdensome. In fact, this could both increase profitability for suppliers and reduce costs for consumers. With better data, the government and industry can identify single points of failure and together work to address them before crisis hit. USP's mapping of manufacturing would still need to continue, but it would be more timely, more comprehensive, and more actionable. Policy tools should continue to include supply chain capital investments, but these could create sporadic output without demand. Many companies in the Medical Countermeasures Coalition invest at risk. This is not sustainable. A better mechanism is a predictable market for supply. The federal government, through CMS, the VA, DoD, and the SNS, should shift procurement criteria to explicitly reward multi-year purchasing contracts and pay for resilience. If quality and redundancy reduce systemic risk, they should be economically recognized. If the VA or the DoD won't pay modestly for reduced medicine dependence on China, why would the private sector? Rio's Partners actually has developed some cost-saving models around this. Recommendation number two, and this one is so common sense: build a multilateral resilience compact with our democratic allies with guardrails. India is central to US supply. The strategic move is not to sideline India or other democratic allies. It is to structure the relationship like what we are seeing with critical minerals under President Trump. In fact, we talk about friendshoring and nearshoring. There is no shore with Canada and Mexico. We started the Bio5 under the Biden administration with Tarun, my colleague, a multilateral resilience framework that included, number one, joint mapping, number two, coordinated stockpiling, three, shared quality oversight, four, planned diversification, and five, aggregation of demand. This should be expanded. But guardrails matter with supply assurance commitments with our friends during crises. Resilience cannot be one way. Recommendation number three, and this one is about hegemony: innovation in manufacturing and regulatory frameworks. Artificial intelligence is transforming life sciences. AI-enabled process control in manufacturing drugs allows real-time monitoring, early detection of deviations, and predictive quality management, reducing shortages and waste. AI also supports continuous and modular biomanufacturing, enabling smaller and distributed production systems that can be reconfigured rapidly, fungibility. Federal funding should prioritize innovation standards for manufacturing medicine, and APICS has good recommendations here. This is not for efficiency, it is for geopolitical leverage. There is a direct parallel between biotechnology today and the internet in the 1990s. The United States did not dominate the internet by restricting others. It dominated by defining the architecture. DARPA funded the early protocols. US institutions developed TCP IP. The standards were open, interoperable, and scaled through American universities and companies. Once those standards became embedded, the global digital economy ran on them. Meta, Google, Uber, Netflix, Amazon are all US companies. Will the bioindustrial companies in the next decade be American or Chinese? If we build the open, interoperable architecture first and tie it to access to the world's largest pharmaceutical market, the US, the global firms will design to US standards. Let me close with this. Pharmaceuticals are not simply consumer goods. China understands this and has pursued a long-term industrial policy accordingly. India understands this, and it has positioned itself as a global manufacturing hub. So 3 things. If we provide supply chain visibility and world resilience, the private sector will deliver. We can't make or stockpile every drug, every input for those drugs, but with allied cooperation, we can. And finally, we can own the AI biotechnology revolution as we did the internet revolution. The Commission's work has been and will be critical because economic security and health security are now inseparable. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for your expert testimonies. We appreciate you all being here, especially Dr. Bhowmick, who I believe traveled 30 hours and just arrived from India. Thank you so much for being here. So we'll now move to questions, and I'll go first, taking chair's prerogatives. It's my understanding that estimated 269 million Indians have been lifted out of poverty over the last few years, since I believe 2022 is a stat that I read. If that's even close to true, that's a remarkable number. I think, in comparison, we've spent a lot of time talking about China's economic model, and over, I think, 25 to 30 years, only 750 million people were lifted out of poverty during that time in a much different economic model than what India has pursued. So, these numbers are debatable, but if they're even close to true, it says a lot about India's recent economic growth model. And so but it's essential to understand how India has done that. They've done it within a democratic framework. They've relied more on market competition, services-led growth, and direct benefits transfers to citizens. And so moving forward, I guess I would ask, and we can start with Dr. Bhowmick, what policy choices should India be making over the next 5 to 10 years that would continue that growth? And then specifically related to China, does India's dependence on China, does de-risking from China, does that jeopardize that economic growth? Because that economic growth is not just important for India, that building of a middle class in India, that drives economic growth for the entire world over the next, again, 5, 10, 15 years. It is such an important engine. Can you talk about how China, well, specifically what choices India would need to make, then how dependence on China would fit into that, and maybe if the other witnesses could talk about, the tech and AI ecosystems, and then health and pharmaceuticals, and how that, and what you think about India's choices there.
Thank you for the question. Well, I believe that one of the major, in terms of de-risking with China is concerned, India's labor-intensive sectors are the main sectors that essentially increase income for the financial classes that are just above the poverty line. The lack of reciprocity in trade with China is which kind of essentially creates an impediment for labor-intensive sectors. So that is somewhere where de-risking with China and finding alternative routes for Indian supply markets is something that would be very relevant in terms of Indian policy choices, especially when we speak about India's developmental as well as poverty objectives. Thank you.
Commissioner, I would say that not reducing some of these dependencies will put in jeopardy, in my view, India's long-term growth for a couple of reasons. One is, as Chan talked about, resilience has an economic value, and we need to be thinking about that. And I do think Indian policymakers are doing that. But just on its own terms, India is facing the same challenge that many other developing economies are facing as well when it comes to China's overcapacity, which is being inundated with manufactured goods that will put out of business Indian manufacturers that are trying to climb the value chain right now. And I think there's a recognition of that. And the challenge, of course, as we've seen here, is there are short-term economic incentives to maintain some of those links that over the long term will undermine India's growth prospects.
Thank you. Dr. Harjivan?
Yeah, I think there's 3 steps. First, in the 1970s, is the Green Revolution. India became self-sufficient in food. Number 2, under Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, they opened up the economy internally, and through that we saw the development of emphasis, but also vaccine manufacturing, drug manufacturing. It was often focused on scale and low cost. We also saw retinal surgery, et cetera, became a leader in the low cost, high impact health outputs. I think what we're seeing now is if they can open up the economy even further internationally, I think we'll see a lot of these companies use data from not just India, but from other countries as well, and move up the value chain, as Tarun was saying. I think there's lots of opportunities here in combining both that efficiency, that scale, and then the AI together, especially in healthcare. And there's going to be a big focus on that because of their digital architecture with the cards they have around using health data as well, using that health data to do clinical trials faster, to looking at health impacts, adverse events, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Brands?
Thank you very much. Thanks also to our panelists. I have three questions triggered by Mr. Chhabra's testimony, but I'd welcome thoughts from our other two panelists as well. First, in your written statement, you mentioned possibilities for export control alignment and critical minerals reciprocity. Could you say a little bit more about those subjects and how they might play in the future of U.S.-India cooperation?
Thank you, Commissioner. So I think the export control point, I think, was made well by Ms. Ford in the previous panel, which is I think, a sine qua non of further technology sharing, which should be in the cards, and the relationship must be accompanied by stronger alignment on not just the pro forma, the de jure export controls, but actual implementation capability and enforcement capability, and then connectivity between our bureaucracies and theirs on this. And that matters not just in the China context, but it matters in the Russia context as well. I think there's movement actually in that direction. I think at a high level there's an understanding about it. But whenever there is some sort of breakdown in that or some sort of incident that precipitates concern, it has to be addressed immediately in the relationship. I think with respect to critical minerals, there is a lot of regulatory harmonization that could happen, but the core of it is essentially what we need to do with many other allies, not just India and partners as well, which is to create more barriers over time as we develop more capacity in the US and like-minded ecosystem, but not be afraid to kind of put up very significant barriers, purchase commitments, just as we're talking about in the pharma and healthcare space as well. And I think there's movement in that direction, but India should be part of that solution.
Maybe, if we think about the U.S.-China competition as something that extends globally, how should we be thinking about India as a potential competitive asset to the United States in regions beyond South Asia? I'm thinking about Africa. I'm thinking about issues like digital payments. There may be other and better examples, but is this a subject that you've thought at all about?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll give you an example of that, which is I think the U.S. posture toward India's digital public infrastructure, right? Which I think for some time had been somewhat hostile. I think the effort in the previous administration was to try to have an extended discussion with India, the Indian government, but also their own providers and partners in that effort to bring in U.S. companies, other like-minded companies as well, because that infrastructure can reach many countries around the Indo-Pacific, sub-Saharan Africa as well, but it need not be at the expense of U.S., whether financial services or U.S. digital service providers. So I think we've actually moved significantly in that particular space, and I think it sets a good example. I think the other area here is, and I think Soumya mentioned this in the previous panel as well, we should be thinking quite a bit about whose AI is powering applications that are going to be deployed globally. I think there's significant reason to worry about the security and trustworthiness of China's AI models for a variety of reasons that we could get into. And I think there's scope for us to have something like a trusted framework for AI or a framework for trusted AI that we could agree on with India, with many other countries, because that's going to matter not just at the digital layer, but also the physical layer when increasingly goods are going to be kind of carrying models and application layers for models.
And one last question. You made the overarching point that none of this is going to work if left to normal bureaucratic processes and it requires top-level political leadership. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yes, thanks for that question in particular. I mean, my experience has been that the bureaucratic default in both Washington and Delhi when it comes to deepening the relationship is caution, delay, lowest common denominator outcomes for for a variety of reasons. Most of the significant plays that we should be undertaking entail the interests of a variety of agencies in the United States and a variety of ministries in the United States, and the only way to get things done is with head of state office involvement. That's been true for some time. The U.S.-India nuclear deal during the Bush administration would not have happened without that as well. So that need not be with a particular person or office, but head of state involvement, finding a designee is absolutely crucial, or very little happens.
Thank you very much.
So virtually, we have Commissioner Hodges. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey,
Okay.
good morning. Yeah, hi, I'm here. Yeah. Mr. Chhabra, you've described the next few years as a critical window for building trusted frameworks with like-minded democracies. And today you discussed India as a potential scale market for the U.S. Agree this is a unique opportunity and a necessary step. I want to talk a little bit about how we build a genuinely trusted framework with India without creating a back channel that Beijing is set to exploit. As has been discussed earlier, India remains structurally dependent on Chinese components across its technology supply chains. You just flagged that cloud and API access are significant loopholes at existing export controls. And as you know, given your time at the NSC, Beijing exploits a number of methods, whether through Chinese-linked components and infrastructure, third country subsidiaries, and commercial relationships. So my question to you is, can you share a little bit more about the alignment on ICT barriers and steps the U.S. and India can take to make the potential scale market more likely in a trusted way?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that. So the first I'd say there's good news in that since 2020, India's taken some significant steps. As was discussed in the previous panel, they banned a number of Chinese software applications. They also undertook a very significant effort to create standards for trusted supply chains when it comes to critical communications goods as well. I think actually setting an example for a number of other countries as well. So I think there's actually a will to do that. The question is how much cost to incur and at what level to kind of cut off some of these supply chains and the importation of these goods. I think this is where bringing the ICTS conversation into broader trade talks is actually quite important because the trade consequences would actually be quite significant. And this is where if we were to come into better alignment, both on the security risks of discrete IoT goods, of cloud services, of Chinese connected vehicles, also then talk about what the market implications of that could be, I think we can actually, again, create a common trusted market and hopefully one that into which we could bring a much broader array of like-minded countries and developing countries as well.
Perfect, thank you. And quick follow-up on that is, how much of this is government-led versus business engagement from Delhi to the U.S.? Is there a role for the private sector to engage directly to push this, or do you think it needs to be government-led? Thinking about your earlier comments on sort of the appetite for engagement.
I'd certainly welcome my co-panelists' views on this as well, but I would say both are essential. The previous administration engaged in was to have national security advisor-led missions with senior business leaders on the U.S. side, meeting with counterparts on the Indian side as well. I think we found that by doing that, deals that might have taken years could instead happen over the course of weeks or months, or at least be catalyzed that way.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Slevin.
Thank you. Picking up on Commissioner Hodges' questions, Mr. Chhabra, on the ICTS coordination. What role, as a commission, we provide recommendations to Congress. And so interested in your thoughts and invite the other panelists as well as to how can Congress kind of deal with these complicated issues that do require some speed and agility that the executive branch is best positioned to often conceive and execute, but where there's a need for durability across administrations.
I think it can start with strong oversight of the ICTS authorities that the Commerce Department already has, and which you know very well, Commissioner. I think ensuring that the department is adequately addressing the risks of goods that are being imported from China, which are going to be deeply networked and into all sorts of IoT related networks. So the way I think we have to think about this is cars are going to be integrated into smart cities. These cars will also be integrated into our grid to some degree as well. So we have to stop thinking about these as kind of discrete goods, but rather something being plugged into a network where we already know that China has placed malware to essentially pre-position for massive disruption. Why would we create more vulnerabilities for these goods? And why would we not go to like-minded countries around the world that are already facing similar sort of cyber threats to kind of align on what the threat landscape looks like and how we could come up with a common framework for preventing that from happening, and then again creating a positive market for goods produced in each of our countries.
Thanks for that. Dr. Harjivan?
I would just add that if we think about the trope of data being the new oil, I think health data, and I'm a bit biased here, is the nuclear fuel, right? Everyone's got their health data except for you. And often it's in silos because of incumbents. I think my view is that this needs to be government nudged, but consortium led. And the idea is to have common data architecture to collect data in similar forms, because whoever understands genomic data, clinical data, manufacturing data will own the next bioeconomy. And that means working with our multilateral partners to define those data architecture. We've got a very disparate healthcare system, but if you look at the NHS or Ontario and Canada, they've got unified cradle-to-grave healthcare data. India's got a similar model as well. If we can develop AI models around that, we can not just develop new drugs faster, we can develop new products for the economy that could be things like using keratin for plastic cups, et cetera. So this becomes very important. But first is getting the architecture right and working in a multilateral environment. It has to be industry-led, but they're not going to do this on their own because they're incumbents who want siloed data as well. It needs to be nudged by the government.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My co-panelist, Mr. Chhabra, has essentially explained the supply chain on critical minerals very well. I just want to make a point on that particular supply chain to co-chair's question. Post-2020, when the tightening around Chinese imports was in place in India, in 2023, there was a complete export ban on germanium and gallium and other kind of imports from China to India, and which essentially led to the larger highlighting of ICET during that time frame, and which also brings me back to what Mr. Chhabra mentioned, that the time is right, and it is also urgent where you find like-minded countries for these kind of partnership, not only as a hedge, but also in terms of diversifying your own domestic capabilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Commissioner Shamavonian, who is on with us virtually.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna build off Commissioner Slevin's questions related to supply chain risks and economic coercion. We have seen, as has been pointed out by this panel, China's weaponization of supply chains to restrict and control exports of critical inputs, require disclosure that products aren't going to U.S. defense purposes, and that is layered on top of some of the challenges, broad challenges related to the China Shock 2.0, where China is flooding the market with low-cost goods and inputs and really depressing the ability of domestic manufacturers to produce those products. So this question is to the panel, but would really welcome your views on how you would assess China's economic coercion strategy, their toolkit, and the ability of the Indian government to respond effectively, especially as we are concurrently talking about greater integration of our supply chains and looking to India as a potential secure supplier as we move away from China.
I can go first there as well. So to me, this one should be fairly easily, at least in the pharma space. So we know how much India depends on China for KSMs, et cetera. But actually, I kind of want some of my drugs to come from China because they're cheap. I just don't want all my drugs to come from China, right? We need diversification of supply. And I think there's a lot of countries who are willing to meet that need, including the US. The US is a high-cost market, so we need innovation to lower the costs, but there's alternative sources as well. I always make it akin to the fact that a fast food restaurant has got 3 suppliers of tomatoes. They may come from Mexico, they may come from California, they may come from Texas. But when our drugs, we got one single supplier. And not just the KSMs, but it could be a reagent or a solvent. And we've got multiple points of failure in the drug supply chain. We need diversification across all 3. To achieve that, at least for drugs, it's a very low-cost solution, is advanced market commitments. So right now, at least for drugs, it's a spot market where the cheapest player can come in and supply the drugs. If we have longer-term contracts, 5 years, with known players who've got visibility into the supply chain, we can solve for that problem. We can have better predictability of supply, but we also have better diversification through that supply as well. So to me, at least for drugs, it's not that hard of a problem. It's actually easy to solve. I think it's harder for things like semiconductors. We need fabs, et cetera. But for drugs, this is a pretty fungible manufacturing base.
Thank you for the question. In terms of economic coercion in the supply chains linked to China, between India and China, in my opinion, it's not something that is very recent. This is something which is implemented over the years, but the effects of it is very long term. It's not something that you can do away with in a very short period of time. So that being there, the kind of frameworks that India is choosing currently, not only in terms of its domestic capabilities, but also I believe that since multilateral frameworks in terms of trade and economic partnerships are turned to be volatile from what we have seen, from what our experience has been over the last few decades, the current focus is also on bilateral partnerships within multilateral frameworks that help bring supply chain resilience across these critical and sensitive nodes that India has been concerned about over the last few years. Thank you.
I would just underscore that India, like the United States, Japan, Australia, Canada, South Korea, the Philippines, Europe, has been a target of Chinese economic coercion. And so as a result of that, I thought it was actually good news that despite some of the trade tensions over the last several months, India's response to that has been to double down with technology cooperation initiatives with many of those same countries to find ways to reduce their supply chain dependencies on China rather than increasing those or moderating those longstanding efforts to reduce those dependencies. So I think that's ballast that we should be taking advantage of.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shriver.
Thank you, and thanks to the witnesses. Appreciate your testimony and particularly colleagues who recently served in government. Thank you for your excellent work there. Maybe start with Mr. Chhabra. What is your understanding of and maybe assessment of Pax Silica, and is this a potential platform to achieve some of the objectives you were describing? Has India expressed optimism about this as an initiative and platform?
Thanks, Commissioner. My understanding is that India is interested in being a part of Pax Silica, and I think the ambition is quite high for it, which is great. I think the question is where will they focus? Because as I mentioned earlier, I think the challenge, long-standing challenge, as you mentioned yourself in the previous panel, is often high ambition and not so much on the execution side. And so I think the key question for Pax Silica will be where do we want to bring India in? Where do we want to enmesh them, whether it's on the critical mineral side, whether it's on the pharmaceutical side, whether it's on the data center side? What are some very key deliverables that, again, at the head of state level, we can hold our bureaucracies accountable for achieving and set clear goals for the private sector as well?
Appreciate it. The other two witnesses, you both in your respective areas talked about resilience. And Mr. Harjivan, you mentioned this is so simple and this is so obvious. And whenever I hear something like that, it makes me think, well, if it's that simple, why hasn't it happened? I mean, what are the obstacles that have prevented a mapping of the supply chain? What are the obstacles? We actually had a discussion and a recommendation that was adjacent to what you're talking about last year. We see the need for data, but Mr. Bhowmick, you talked about, or Dr. Bhowmick, you talked about sort of a resilience playbook, early warning, and rather than ad hocing it. So what has stood in the way? Just people haven't come up with the idea, or we haven't had a single belly button saying, I'm going to take charge of this and make it happen, or what have been the obstacles?
I think it's natural company behavior. If you're an incumbent, you don't want things to change, right? In the healthcare system, everyone says they're poor, but actually everyone makes a whole lot of money, right? We know how much of the GDP is within the healthcare system. So when I said it's very simple, I was being a bit glib, but it was very simple in the sense of supply chain transparency. When I buy a T-shirt, I can find out where the cotton was made. I can find out where the labor was, the carbon footprint. When I put a pill in my mouth, I have no idea where it's from, right? So it's not like this is new ground to say we need visibility into the supply chain. We need tier 2, tier 3 supplier visibility like we do with automotive. When you go buy a car, it says X percent is made in Mexico, X percent is made in Canada. So that's what I'm saying, it's not hard. Other industries have it. They just don't want to change. They need a bit of a nudge. In terms of the price for generics, if you look at the value to society, generics are incredible. I mean, they save lives, they make lives more livable, but they're way too low in terms of cost. Now, actually, we don't need to actually spend more for those drugs. We can actually get cheaper costs because right now there's no predictability in demand. So if a certain purchaser, a PBM, can change their mind immediately and buy another low-cost supplier of that medication, often Chinese or Indian, right? If we simply said to a US or allied manufacturer, we'll give you a 5-year contract for X number of doses at X number of price, they'll get that predictability of demand. They can make that capital infrastructure. It just takes someone to make that step. I've had a lot of conversations with the VA and with TRICARE, et cetera, and I think there's a bit of lethargy in this. It's like, why try harder? It's kind of the mantra versus let's make a little bit of initiative here. But this is an easy problem to solve with these smaller levers. The AI infrastructure, I think those are a lot harder challenges. Certainly, I spent a lot of time with Tarun in the Situation Room talking about the China threats. What I'm talking about is not really a China threat or an India threat. It is simply mitigation for our current US economic models, which are not optimized.
Thank you. I'll just add a point to Mr. Harjivan's thing. I think when you look at the Indian markets, they are very, very price sensitive. For example, if you compare it to, say, a Japanese market or somebody's buying a garlic from a supermarket, they will try to look at where the garlic is coming from. But when you look at a 1.4 billion market, it's very price sensitive, and this is somewhere where it really, more than the footprint, the price indication and how the market mechanics work becomes more important. Coming to your question on the supply chain playbook, I mean, there has to be multiple points, but say, for example, if I pick up the US-India FTA, that's being negotiated right now. I think right now confusion is the biggest tariff. For example, if you look at the domestic, in a domestic sense, without reaching any kind of finalization or any kind of agreement, there's a lot of disruption just over the confusion of it. So I think, although that is a very strong recommendation, but we are quite far away from it when we look at, say, in terms of economic partnerships, there has to be more concrete and more transparency on what you're looking at in terms of partnerships so that you can make your supply chains more resilient. So that is, I think, one of the major roadblocks, and the US-India FTA is just one of the examples of it. Thank you.
Commissioner Price.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for your testimony. The the most important part of our job as a commission is to give recommendations to Congress. So I want to stop a moment and sort of focus on that. Dr. Bhowmick, you gave wonderful testimony. Your written testimony has more suggestions on recommendations. I want to give you 2 minutes to talk about your top recommendation that you think would be most impactful.
Thank you for the question. My top recommendations remain the same, that there has to be more clarity so that you bring down transaction costs in terms of economic partnerships. That remains my top recommendation in terms of supply chain resilience. But when, say, the Congress is looking at India, China, and the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, it has to come out of binary assumptions of India and China specifically, because India is taking up a strategic interdependence with China, which you cannot do away with over a short period of time. So I think this coming from a point of having binaries in what you must choose between India and China, that is not something that is practical when you're implementing it in terms of supply chain resilience. And the second one being, and the most important one being, what I just previously explained, that clarity in economic partnerships, be it the India-US FTA, be it in critical minerals or IC8, a more structured partnerships and how wherever it is going makes more sense, not only in terms of diplomacy, but also helps bring down the costs for producers, because like I mentioned, it is a very price sensitive market. The delays, the time cost of it has a very high impact on how it plays out in the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Harjivan, thank you for your excellent testimony. As our chairman mentioned, last year we did have a recommendation in terms of increasing visibility into the pharmaceutical supply chain. We are not an advocacy organization, so we give our suggestion and we push them and don't get very far sometimes. Other times we're way more successful. If you had a message, obviously your testimony, but a shorter message that we should be using to get their attention or get the public's attention so that they can push members of Congress, what would that be, or how would you say it?
Yeah, I think supply chain visibility will, the most reduce costs for medications. It is not an extra burden. It will reduce costs because if you have that visibility, you can have that guaranteed purchase commitments as well. Those commitments are trivial in terms of the costs. So for penicillin and amoxicillin, 14-day supply. Right now, we depend almost wholly on China for the precursors for amoxicillin. If we simply said, let's map the supply chain, understand where the choke points are, pay a little bit more for resilience. And again, for a 14-day supply, I'm talking about increasing it from $10 to maybe $11 at most. And in fact, if you have longer-term contracts, that supplier may actually, and I've talked to a lot of these suppliers, they may even reduce the price because now they know they've got a 5-year commitment. So your antibiotic may go down to $8 for a course of therapy. So we're going to reduce costs and resolve the supply chain resiliency or choke point issue as well. So this is what I'm saying. I'm a bit glib, but this is an easy thing to solve because it doesn't cost more money. In fact, you could save costs, and it would improve patients' lives as well.
So making it into a social media post, something as simple as decrease cost for constituents, map your supply chain.
Better quality drug. You know where they're made, you know how they're made, the quality increases, and it's cheaper. So you're getting better quality drugs at a lower cost that don't go into shortage. Those are my 3 points.
Thank you. Mr. Chhabra, what's your best recommendation that you would like to see Congress do?
Again, I think there's enormous opportunity in aligning our ICTS restrictions with China because it's not just a matter of security, but it's a matter of creating a common market and much more predictability for kind of joint efforts on manufacturing and opportunities in a consumer and industrial market too. A couple things we haven't talked about but was touched on the last panel. Number one, on the defense side, we could be focusing much more, I think, on defense articles are at their core commercial goods and then are supplemented with more sensitive items. We've seen deals there go much, much quicker, co-production opportunities. Anduril comes to mind, for example, as a company that's been pursuing opportunities there. And then I would take that, tie it to our cooperation in the Indian Ocean space, where there's a real strategic need, both here and in India as well, to have much better awareness and cooperation and look at co-production opportunities that could specifically address our shared strategic concerns.
Thank you all.
Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you. I'd like to put this question to the panel. So one of our former commissioners, Mike Wessel, when I joined the commission, took me out to breakfast one morning and told me the commission was the over-the-horizon commission, not the alligator closest to the boat commission. And so I'm trying to think about looking out 24 months or 36 months as I hear all of you talk, and everything feels like it's sort of in the next 12 months. As we think about biotech, not pharmaceuticals, but bioindustrials, materials and things like that, as we think about quantum, as we think about the convergence of artificial intelligence with some of those emerging technologies, how should we think about the US-India opportunity? And where should we be making investments that aren't going to pay dividends in the next 12 months, but maybe in the next 3 years? As Mr. Chhabra told me when he was still in government, India is a strategic partner, and we need to think about it not in sort of in the day-to-day all the time, but in the sort of over-the-horizon piece, just like Commissioner Wessel used to say. So welcome your reaction to that, and then I might have some follow-ups.
So I'll go first. I mean, to me, it's all about data standards, interoperability, at least in healthcare. So you mentioned quantum, you mentioned AI, you mentioned manufacturing. These all kind of converge within the biotechnology space. Data is everywhere, but we need to have common metrics around it, metrology. So I'll give an example. So I worked in Operation Warp Speed. I was there since day one, and I remember all the different choke points. We solved them through a very robust multilateral system, by the way, right? But one of the things that I saw was there was an adjuvant for vaccines that were from Chilean tree bark. The only source of this adjuvant, there are no vaccines, Shingrix, Novavax, was this Chilean tree bark. I left Operation Warp Speed, started my own company where we're making it in cell culture. But we made that adjuvant exactly the same as the tree bark because the FDA regulations had to be exactly the same. So this tree made this adjuvant to fight off insects. We're now putting in vaccines because it creates a greater immune response, works well. But that was making it exactly the same. With AI, I can now tailor that product to the actual pathogen or what I want to make it. However, I'm now using generative AI. I worked with Lawrence Livermore. We created 10,000 molecules. Now, when I started consulting, the cost to develop a drug, this in 2000, was about $500 million. 2010, it's now $1 billion. Now, it's $2 billion. We're not seeing the return of technology in drug development because while I'm able to develop 10,000 novel molecules, the regulatory process is still one molecule at a time. And so we need to create standards by which we can accelerate through innovative methods, but with India and with the multilateral allies, standards so that data can come in. We can look at toxicity, we can look at manufacturability, we can look at efficacy in a very rapid way using AI to almost look at the AI, generative AI. That needs to occur. So.
We'll go down to the panel, but Mr. Harjivan, I did not think you were going to lead with data, so you had me at hello.
So, Commissioner, let me just paint a picture of what the world could look like if we don't stay on the case here. So, 10 years from now, we could have, let's say, a third country that's setting up subsidized data centers in India, offering genetic screening and services, hoovering up, 1 billion people's genetic data. We could have half of India's cars could be Chinese connected vehicles. We could have most of the IoT goods in the country running Chinese AI models, and continued dependence on Russian legacy technology because we haven't pressed hard enough, and then data centers that are built by third parties but that are closely connected to China. That's a default course that we could end up on without concerted policy. In a scenario like that, let's think about a Taiwan contingency. Let's think about a border scenario. The vulnerabilities India already has and that our joint cooperation already have would be far, far worse by orders of magnitude. And yet that's a world that we could easily be headed toward without very, very concerted action.
Thank you for the question. It's quite remarkable that we are discussing the question on emerging tech on the eve of the AI Impact Summit, where the CEOs of OpenAI and Google are all discussing implementability as well as scalability and US-India partnerships in emerging tech. Uh, I specifically believe that India-US partnerships in AI and emerging tech must be built and on two specific pillars. One is trust, and the second one being development. In terms of trust, we have burnt our fingers in terms of collaborating with quite a few Chinese tech companies, and because of which there has been quite a little bit of protectionism in the last few years. What I also feel is very important in terms of, and what India is seeking in terms of leveraging emerging tech, is its developmental objectives, which is advancing people, planet, and prosperity. So the implementation of AI in not only bringing people out of poverty, but also essentially making climate action work, ranging from healthcare to say other sustainability goals, is what the basis should form of US-India partnerships in this domain. Thank you.
Let me just do one more question for the panel. We'll start down at your end, Mr. Bhowmick, since you traveled 30 hours to be here. Can you, all of you, just talk about how we should think about the India space industry? One of the things that we talked about last year was sort of what US-China competition looks like in the space industry, but an area that I think India actually does very well as a country is in space. How should we evaluate the sort of space industry, space ecosystem there? Should we think it as something that's organic, or something where they already sort of have historic investments or cooperation with Russia that's sort of gotten there? How do we think about India space, and where are the opportunities that we should think about as we look towards recommendations at the end of this year?
I'll actually go first with no comment.
I think this is actually an enormous opportunity. Thanks for the question. We're going to see enormous commercial activity with significant strategic implications to around lunar exploration, for example, in the coming years. The opportunity to bring Indian firms, including very exciting startups in India, into that space commercially, and then potentially do more sensitive things in the future, I think is enormous. It was one of a driving force behind the bid in the previous administration to bring India into the Artemis Accords, which I think was a significant strategic decision actually on their part, given the kind of the legacy issues with their space program. And we've already seen this happening as well. I think there's also just a significant kind of popular dimension to this. So it was a big deal, I think, to kind of have an American and Indian astronaut travel together in a recent mission, and we should be doing a lot more of that because it provides more ballast in the relationship and excitement about what we could be doing together in this sector.
Well, space is not exactly my domain of expertise, but overall, I'd say that while India is looking at something called frugal AI, and like Mr. Chhabra mentioned about, there's quite a few exciting startups working in the space domain. What I specifically think is important and is a bilateral symbiotic relationship with the US in this particular domain would be effective technology that comes at a low cost. That's a win-win for both the countries. That's a particular space in terms of space that we can look into. Thank you.
Thank you. If Commissioner Stivers will give me one more, I won't even take a second round if you give it to me.
You go.
I'll just give it to the panel again. Your frugal AI comment just made me think about this. One of the areas that the Commission's research working group is looking at right now is the open source ecosystem, and how if you look at something like Hugging Face, 17 of the top 20 open source models are currently Chinese models. How should we think about the open source ecosystem As we look at it through sort of India and the frugal AI approach, how should we look at it more broadly? What's your thinking on open source AI and related issues?
Yeah, I feel that frugal AI is very relevant to India because, like I mentioned, it's a price-sensitive market. If you kind of price technology, it is not something that reaches the masses. So, I wouldn't have a specific answer to that, but I'd like to say that, this is something that investments are required to keep the inclusivity aspect on in terms of technology. Thank you.
I think the price sensitivity in the Indian market is something that American firms have navigated before and quite successfully in many cases. I think, though, it's important to be very clear about what some of the risks are of using China's AI models. And those, I mentioned it a bit earlier, but let me say a little bit more about it. Those include misalignment. They include what some researchers have called sleeper agents, where you could kind of activate certain behaviors in the models that you don't want to see. A political bias as well, and also using models where the product has actually been built from what's called distillation, which is essentially kind of industrial espionage as well. And so I think those need to be known. That actually has nothing to do with whether a model is open or proprietary. It's really about whether you trust the vendor. And so to some degree, I think I'm a little bit puzzled as to why we don't have more of a focus on trusted AI. We had a significant policy focus, which I think was excellent, on trusted telecom. AI is going to be much more pervasive, right, across the economy in terms of strategic significance, and we need to have a framework for trust there as well, independent of the question of whether models are open or proprietary.
I'm just going to build on that and harp on my notion about interoperable architecture. Trust is so important. And I think China doesn't have a lot of trust. India's got a lot of data. It could be a frugal AI system. It could be open. We don't know what's going to emerge. But I do think the United States, not alone, but with its multilateral partners, can develop these interoperable architectures. And if we do that, it can be trusted. And industry likes predictability. Once you create these standards, I think whether the US companies, our democratic allies, will invest more in these and we'll see more outputs as well. But we've got to create that architecture by which they can invest against, that is trusted, and so consumers trusted, investors trusted, et cetera. Right now, it's a Wild West, I understand that, but if we create that standard platform, we can accelerate things, but with trust and with higher output.
Dr. Bhowmick, we've talked a lot today about defense, technology, supply chains. We actually haven't talked that much about trade. Agreement about 2 weeks ago, the U.S. agreed to reduce tariffs from 50% to 18%. From what I've read, India reduced tariffs on industrial goods to 13.5%. What's your opinion of the trade relationship and the new deal that was just announced 2 weeks ago?
I mean, that's what we see, that it's going to be reduced from 15 to 18%, 50 to 18%, but that is not yet confirmed. What I see in terms of the sector specific of the trade agreement is that while a lot of agricultural and labor intensive sectors are said to be protected, but we are yet to have clarity on that. So that is one very sensitive point of the FTA that still needs a sort of solution. But apart from that, what I previously mentioned, that in terms of the US-India FTA right now, confusion is the biggest tariff. We still don't have clarity, which is leading to quite a bit of, domestic, quite a lot of domestic sectors feeling disturbed, I'd say, in their natural transaction and in their forecasting of the hedging processes that needs to be undertaken. So that is that stays one of the main points. Apart from that, of course, labor-intensive sectors, be dairy, agriculture, textiles. That is one aspect that needs to be looked into. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Price.
Thank you. Just a couple of technical questions. First, I was going to ask, I'll start with Mr. Chhabra. You talked in your testimony about creating these trusted standards, and then we just talked about it several more times. Can you just get into the weeds a little bit with me? Government doing it, industry doing it, partnership doing it. How would this work, and what needs to happen to get it started?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner. I think government needs to do this in part because the basis of this is really about security concerns, and that necessarily involves the assessments of the intelligence community and resources that are available only to the government. I think a good example of this is the connected vehicle rule that the ICTS office published during the previous administration, and then more case-specific rules that they published as well on kind of particular investments from China and the United States, say in the telecom sector as well. I think we want to take the framework that informed that kind of reporting and try to encourage India and other like-minded countries to adopt similar frameworks and create a similar basis of expertise, so we have kind of a community talking to one another. Some of this work began actually under the auspices of the State Department, bringing around 15 countries to talk about some of these issues. But it was in early 2024, and I think that needs to be carried forward. I think this relates also to the question about the trade deal, which is hopefully we can now get to the next stage of kind of discussions, which I think is what are the steps we can take, including regulatory alignment like this, that help us both reduce our vulnerability to China's economic coercion and also reduce our exposure to China's economic predatory practices. And if that's kind of the shared goal, I think there's a lot we could do in the regulatory space together.
Are there standards that we use already, and this would be building on it, or are you saying it's Wild West?
I think the standards that were promulgated by the Commerce Department, for example, on connected vehicles, were quite good and could be adopted easily by other countries. I think similarly, there's standards around security for data centers as well. And again, I would suggest that there should be a framework around trusted AI. That's more nascent, but something I think a lot of industry actors would be happy to work with the government on.
Thank you. And one last question, Dr. Bhowmick. As I was looking at the end of your testimony, and you're talking about looking to help U.S. policy that looks to help India build redundancy and capability, et cetera. As we talk to industry here, what will they say are their barriers when they try and start new enterprises with India?
Yeah, I think there is, in terms of redundancy, there's a lot of streamlining that is required, especially in terms of the labor input that goes into the US-India supply chain, specifically the services sector. So there needs to be more kind of standards and training processes over there to reduce redundancies in that particular aspect, where the dependence is not only on low-cost labor, but on high-skilled labor. So, yeah, thank you.
But would industry say they can't do something or they can't invest more because there are certain other kinds of barriers, regulation, things like that?
The barriers will mostly be in terms of cost barriers, because when I talk about skilling, and you move towards high-skilled labor inputs, there's a lot of investment that is required for that. Given the labor is abundant, if you move towards high skilling processes, it would need a sort of investment, which leads to be a little bit costly for the industry. So long there is no support from the government or other forms of, say, funding sources, that remains one of the barriers.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Hodges has a question virtually.
Hi, thank you. Yes, Mr. Harjivan, I want to thank you for your recommendations on identifying single points of failure due to over-reliance on China. It's an issue that goes beyond APIs and the medical community. The vulnerabilities don't stop at the pharmacy. Many of the same Chinese chemical manufacturers supplying pharmaceutical precursors also dominate production of intermediaries used in agriculture, advanced materials, everyday household needs, and defense-relevant manufacturing. So hoping to ask you today, because when your written testimony, you mentioned that U.S. chemical industry, unlike Europe, is in a position to act. So I just want to ask you sort of plainly today, looking beyond pharma, should the U.S. do more to protect its sectors to avoid these types of future chokeholds that the Chinese are looking to create? And if so, what steps should the U.S. consider when it looks into these areas, specifically related to the chemical industry and biotechnology?
Yeah, if you look at the U.S. drug industry, it started in New Jersey, outside of the petroleum industry, right? Because it was adjacent to it. So Merck, J&J, all these great companies were adjacent to oil refineries because the precursors do come from petroleum products. So there's an analogy there already of U.S. companies being successful with that. What happened was simply the cost drivers, environmental issues as well that pushed it to China. I think my view is that I'm happy to get some of my drugs or precursors from China, just not all of them. I don't care where they come from, Idaho, Ireland, or India. We just don't need one source. And we need to look at the whole value chain. What happens often, we'll say, oh, well, the final dosage form needs to be made here in the US, but then we realize the APIs come from India, et cetera. During Operation Warp Speed, as I mentioned, we realized choke points that we never realized would happen. We had to get, there was a dearth of sand for vials. I didn't know there's a shortage of sand in the world, fine sand. Rolled steel from China. We saw sativa bags from France. So this is where the visibility starts coming in. You need to understand where those choke points are, and then diversify those choke points. I think what we also want to make sure is that when we look at the end product, I said pay more for these drugs. We want to make sure it's not just the end supplier extracting those economic rents. So we can't have a PBM simply we pay them more and they pay the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers the same amount, because those players will still exit. So it's about managed diversification. And also, I think at the same time, I think there's a real opportunity for investing in innovation for new manufacturing technologies as they are emerging, but we need to accelerate those as well. But I think it's actually, in this case, again, to sound glib, it's easy to diversify some of that manufacturing because the costs are not that high to move from, let's say, China to India or even to other countries that can supply those precursors. But the first step is to understand all the choke points along the way. If there's a certain reagent, that can gum things up immediately. And as Tarun was mentioned, the Chinese actually and other adversaries are very adept at understanding where those choke points are. And simply, if we are in a heightened political situation, could use those choke points just simply to create confusion. If you can't get steel for your car, that's one thing. If you can't get your medication to survive, that's a very different thing, and that can cause a lot of confusion in a global environment.
Thank you.
Well, unless there's any other questions from commissioners, we will close. In closing, thank you again to all the witnesses for your excellent testimonies today. You can find those testimonies as well as a recording of the hearing on the uscc.gov website. I'd like to note that the Commission's next hearing will take place on Monday, March 2nd. That hearing is titled Part of Your World, U.S.-China Competition Under the Sea. Apparently, there's a Little Mermaid theme. And with that bold observation, we are adjourned.